Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and the ancient world takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we are travelling not to the place most people think of first when they imagine the birth of civilization. Not straight to the muddy banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, not immediately into the cities of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon or Assyria, not into the familiar museum rooms where clay tablets sit under soft lights and kings with curled beards stare out from stone. We're going just beside that world, slightly east of it, toward a land of mountains, rivers, temples, old capitals, and a people whose name once carried real power, but now often slips quietly between the larger names in history books. Tonight, we're going to Elam, and Elam is one of those ancient civilizations that feels almost like a room in history whose door was left half open. You may have heard of Mesopotamia, you may have heard of Egypt. You may have heard of the Indus Valley, China, the Hittites, the Minoans, and the great empires that rose later across the ancient Near East. But Elam often sits in the shadows, even though it was not some small tribe watching history from the edge of the room. Elam was old, Elam was wealthy, Elam had cities, kings, temples, scribes, armies, trade routes, sacred places, and a political life that lasted in one form or another for thousands of years. It stood close enough to Mesopotamia to trade with it, fight with it, borrow from it, influence it, and sometimes frighten it. And yet today, Elam is rarely spoken of with the same excitement as the civilizations it once challenged. That is what makes it so fascinating. There are places in the ancient world that seem to shout at us. Pyramids rise above the desert. Ziggurats leave huge footprints in the dust. Greek temples sit on hilltops and practically demand to be photographed. But Elam is quieter. It is there in broken inscriptions, buried levels at Susa, mountain sanctuaries, royal names, fragments of statues, seals, pottery, and stories told by enemies who did not always mean to preserve its memory, but did anyway. It is history heard through a wall, not gone, exactly, not silent, just muffled. Before we wander into that forgotten world, let me ask you something gentle. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere bright and busy, with the day still moving around you, or somewhere late and quiet, where the house has begun to settle and the room feels softer than it did a few hours ago? Maybe you're listening from a city that is itself built over older streets, older walls, older memories, layer upon layer like so many places on Earth. Or maybe you're far from any ruins at all, curled up somewhere comfortable, letting the ancient past come to you without needing to pack a bag, find your passport, or explain to airport security why you are emotionally attached to a civilization from the Bronze Age. History does that sometimes. It sneaks in and makes itself personal. And if you find this journey soothing, or interesting, or simply a calm way to let your thoughts slow down after a long day, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of the internet reach other people who might enjoy drifting through deep time at a peaceful pace. No pressure, of course. Ancient Elam waited several thousand years to be remembered properly, so it can probably tolerate a few seconds while you decide. But it truly does help, and it lets us keep opening these old doors together. Now settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the noise of the present move farther into the background. We're going toward a landscape where the flat world of Mesopotamia begins to meet the rising lands of the Iranian plateau. To the west were the river plains of southern Iraq, where cities like Ur and Uruk became famous for writing, kingship and temples that climbed upward in steps. To the east were the foothills and mountains of what is now Iran, with valleys, highland routes, mineral wealth, and old communities that had their own ways of living long before empire became a word people carved in stone. Elam grew in that meeting place. It was not fully one thing or the other. It was a bridge, a rival, a neighbour, and sometimes a danger. When people speak about the earlier civilizations, Mesopotamia often becomes the centre of the story. That is understandable. Mesopotamia left behind enormous numbers of clay tablets. Its cities are famous. Its myths still echo through later cultures. It gave us some of the earliest writing we can read, and because of that, it feels close to us in a way. A civilization that writes a great deal is a civilization that leaves plenty of notes on the kitchen table for the future. Elam left writing too, but not as much survives in a way we can easily read. Some of its languages and scripts have been difficult, damaged, or only partly understood. So the story of Elam comes to us in pieces. And because history often favours those who leave the clearest paperwork, Elam has sometimes been treated as a background figure in someone else's epic. But that is misleading. Elam was not background. Imagine standing in southern Mesopotamia thousands of years ago in a city where merchants, priests and officials are looking eastward. Beyond the marshes, beyond the rivers, beyond the borderlands, there is a civilization that controls routes into the highlands. There are resources there that lowland cities want: stone, timber, metals. Precious materials. There are strong rulers there, and cities that cannot simply be ignored. Sometimes Elam sends goods. Sometimes it sends ambassadors. Sometimes it sends armies. Sometimes it takes what it wants and leaves Mesopotamian kings writing about it in tones that sound, even after all these centuries, a little wounded. That is one of the reasons Elam matters. It reminds us that the ancient world was not a neat map with one glowing centre and a few dim edges around it. It was a network. Civilizations rose beside each other, pressed into each other, borrowed from each other, misunderstood each other, married into each other, fought each other, and occasionally carried each other's statues away after a successful raid, which was apparently one of the ancient world's less neighbourly habits. A god statue, once taken, was not just a religious object. It was a political message. It was a way of saying, your power has moved. Your protection is now in our hands. In that world, Elam was a player strong enough to take part in such messages, and important enough that Mesopotamian rulers could not afford to forget it. The heart of Elam is often associated with Susa, one of the great ancient cities of the Near East. Susa was not a small place with a brief moment of importance. It was inhabited across a vast stretch of time, from very early periods into the age of Persian kings and beyond. It sat in a region that connected lowland plains with mountain routes, a position that made it valuable again and again. If cities could become old by listening, Susa would be one of the great listeners of the ancient world. It heard languages change. It watched rulers come and go. It saw temples rise, palaces burn, scribes press signs into clay, and later empires build over older foundations. A city like that is not just a settlement. It is a stack of human time. And in that stack, Elam took shape. Not always as one unified kingdom in the simple way we might imagine from a modern map, but as a shifting world of regions, rulers, and centres of power. Elam could refer to a land, a people, a political tradition, and a set of cultures connected across southwestern Iran. There were lowland areas near Susa and highland areas farther inland. There were dynasties whose authority rose and fell. There were moments when Elam was powerful enough to invade Mesopotamia, and moments when Mesopotamian empires pushed back hard. Its history is not a straight road. It is more like a mountain path that appears, disappears, doubles back, and then suddenly opens onto a view you did not expect. This makes Elam harder to summarize, but also more real. Civilizations are rarely as tidy as the labels we give them. We like names because names help us hold the past in our hands. Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, Elam. But behind each name were farmers, potters, metal workers, traders, priests, mothers, children, soldiers, messengers, builders, and tired officials who probably also had days when they wished the paperwork would stop. There were people who woke before sunrise, who worried about crops, who watched the sky, who carried goods along roads, who poured offerings, who learned the words of prayers, who feared distant kings, who laughed at local jokes that are now completely unrecoverable, which is a shame, because ancient humour is one of history's greatest missing treasures. Elam's world was shaped by geography. the lands of southwestern Iran offered something different from the open, alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had its great rivers and broad fields, but it lacked many raw materials. It needed to reach outward for stone, metal, timber, and luxury goods. Elam, positioned near the Zagros mountains and connected to wider Iranian highland networks, stood along routes that mattered. Geography gave Elam leverage. It was not simply a neighbour beyond the horizon. It was a gatekeeper to things Mesopotamia desired. And in the ancient world, controlling routes could be as important as controlling fields. A road could be a lifeline. A mountain pass could be a treasury. A trade connection could become the quiet foundation of political power. This is where the title of our journey begins to make sense. The forgotten civilization that rivaled Mesopotamia. Rival does not mean it was always stronger, or always richer, or always winning. No ancient power had that kind of luck, no matter what its royal inscriptions tried to claim. Rivaled means it stood in serious relationship to Mesopotamia. It challenged it. It shaped it. It competed with it. It survived beside it for an astonishing length of time. When Akkadian kings looked east, Elam mattered. When Babylonian rulers tried to control the region, Elam mattered. When Assyrian kings thundered through the ancient Near East with terrifying confidence, Elam still mattered. And when later Persian power rose, the old Elamite lands and traditions did not simply vanish. They became part of something larger, woven into the administrative and cultural world of empire. But because Elam is not as familiar, it gives us a rare kind of historical experience. We get to approach it without too many fixed images already in our minds. With Egypt, many people immediately picture pyramids, mummies, pharaohs, and golden masks. With Mesopotamia, they may imagine ziggurats, cuneiform tablets, hanging gardens, and stern-bearded kings. With Elam, the image is less settled. That can feel frustrating, but it is also freeing. We're not just repeating a story everyone already knows. We're trying to recover the outline of a world from scattered evidence, and that is often how archaeology really feels. Not like opening a finished book, but like finding pages in different rooms and slowly realising they belong to the same story. Some of those pages are dramatic. Elamite rulers appear in Mesopotamian texts as enemies, allies, raiders, and political forces. The city of Susa appears again and again, sometimes flourishing, sometimes attacked, sometimes rebuilt. There are royal inscriptions and objects that reveal ambition, devotion, and wealth. There are traces of writing systems that show Elam was not merely borrowing civilization from its western neighbours, but developing its own ways of recording power and identity. There are temples and sacred places that suggest a religious life deeply rooted in local traditions, not just copied from elsewhere. And there are moments of destruction, especially at the hands of Assyria, when the old world of Elam suffered terrible blows. Still, destruction is never the whole story. Ancient kings loved to claim they had erased their enemies completely. They wrote that they destroyed cities, scattered people, smashed gods, and made lands empty. Royal boasting in the ancient world was not known for modesty. If an Assyrian king stubbed his toe successfully, one imagines a scribe might describe it as a victory over the rebellious furniture of the palace. But history has a way of outlasting even the loudest threats. Elam was damaged, changed, absorbed, and transformed, yet its legacy did not disappear. Elamite language continued to be used in important contexts under the Persian Empire. The region remained central to power. Susa itself became one of the great capitals of the Achaemenid kings. Beneath later imperial grandeur, older Elamite foundations remained. That continuity is part of what makes Elam so interesting. It was not simply a lost civilization buried and forgotten in a single catastrophe. It was a long-lived cultural world that changed over time, sometimes independent, sometimes entangled with stronger neighbours, sometimes hidden inside later empires. That is often how the past really works. Civilizations do not always end like a candle being blown out. Sometimes they fade into another light. Their languages become administrative tools. Their cities become imperial capitals. Their gods are renamed, reinterpreted, or carried quietly into new rituals. Their artists influence new styles. Their roads continue to be walked by people who may no longer use the old name, but still live on old ground. So tonight's journey is not only about restoring Elam to the map, it is also about learning to see history differently. We are used to stories of firsts and greatest achievements, the first city, the first empire, the greatest king, the largest monument. These are useful sometimes, but they can flatten the ancient world into a competition, as if civilizations were standing on a podium waiting for medals. Elam asks for another kind of attention. It asks us to look sideways, to notice the neighbour, to follow the trade route, to listen to the language that is not fully understood, to examine the city that kept being rebuilt, to ask why some civilizations become household names, while others, equally old and important, become footnotes. There is something very human about that. Memory is not always fair. Some people, places and cultures are remembered because they left more records. Others because later societies claimed them as ancestors. Others because their monuments were simply too large to ignore. And some are forgotten not because they mattered less, but because their evidence survived differently. Elam belongs to this quieter category. Its story has to be pieced together from archaeology, inscriptions, neighbouring accounts, and careful scholarship. It asks for patience. Conveniently, patience is exactly the kind of mood we're trying to cultivate here, preferably with a blanket nearby and no urgent emails. Picture the land now, gently, not as a fantasy world, but as a real place in deep time. The lowlands warm and wide, rivers moving through the plain, fields depending on water and work. Beyond them, the land begins to rise toward the Zagros. Routes wind through foothills. Traders carry goods between worlds. Susa stands as a meeting point, receiving influences from the west and the east, but belonging fully to neither. Temples mark sacred authority. Palaces gather officials and tribute. Seals are pressed into clay. Messages move from one ruler to another. Somewhere, a scribe learns signs that will outlive him by thousands of years. Somewhere else, a potter shapes a vessel without knowing that one day a broken piece of it may help strangers reconstruct the age in which he lived. And across the borderlands, Mesopotamia watches, sometimes with interest, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with fear. Because Elam is close enough to matter and strong enough to intervene. This is not a distant civilization glimpsed vaguely from afar. This is a neighbour with teeth, a neighbour with wealth, a neighbour with gods of its own, and kings who could speak in the language of power. When Mesopotamian rulers wrote about Elam, they were not writing about a myth. They were writing about a real political force on the eastern horizon, one that could not be wished away. There is also a deep contrast in how these civilizations are remembered. Mesopotamia often feels like the great written archive of early history, the land of tablets and lists, laws and myths, kings and flood stories. Elam feels more like a set of stones under dust, a voice half recovered. But this does not make Elam less important. In some ways, it makes the journey into Elam more intimate. We have to lean in closer. We have to accept uncertainty. We have to let the past remain partly rough around the edges instead of polishing it into something too simple. That kind of honesty matters. Ancient history is not always a clean, brightly lit corridor. Sometimes it is a dim storehouse full of fragments, and the work is to notice which fragments belong together. As we begin, it helps to remember that Elam was never merely a copy of Mesopotamia. It interacted with Mesopotamia constantly, and there was borrowing in both directions. But Elam had its own identity. Its language was different. Its political traditions were different. Its geography shaped different possibilities. Its rulers used local titles and built authority within a world that connected plains and mountains. That difference is important. Too often, cultures near famous civilizations are treated as satellites, as if they existed only because they were close to a brighter centre. Elam challenges that habit. It was not a moon orbiting Mesopotamia. It was another world beside it, sometimes reflecting its light, sometimes casting its own shadow across the plain. And now, as the story opens, we are standing at the edge of that shadow. Behind us are the names everyone knows. Ahead of us is a civilization that deserves to be brought slowly back into view. We will move through its lands, its cities, its kings, its sacred places, its rivalries, its writing, its wars, and its long afterlife. We will try to understand how a civilization can be powerful for so long and still become unfamiliar to so many people later. We will follow the evidence carefully but gently, because this is not a courtroom. It is a nighttime journey through deep history. The goal is not to rush toward an answer, but to let the old world assemble itself piece by piece. So take a slow breath and imagine the dust settling over the ancient plain. Somewhere in the distance, the rivers of Mesopotamia move through their famous cities, but turn your attention eastward now, toward Susa, toward the foothills, toward the roads leading into the Iranian plateau. There, beyond the usual spotlight, another civilization is waiting. It has been waiting a long time, beneath broken walls, buried tablets, royal names, and the patient silence of the earth. And as we move closer, the forgotten rival of Mesopotamia begins to take shape, not as a footnote, not as a rumour, but as one of the great old powers of the ancient world standing beside the rivers, watching, trading, fighting, enduring, and preparing to step back into memory. Elam begins, for most of us, as a name on the edge of another story. It appears beside Mesopotamia the way a mountain range appears at the edge of a river plain, always present, always shaping the weather, but often left out of the postcard. When people imagine the ancient Near East, they usually picture the great flat lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the reed marshes, the canals, the brick cities, the ziggurats rising like stairways for gods who preferred a good view. Mesopotamia feels like the obvious starting point, because so much of early written history seems to gather there. But if you turn your gaze east, just beyond that familiar world, the story widens. The land rises, the routes become more difficult, the rivers are different, the mountains begin to matter, and in that meeting place between plain and plateau, Elam grew into one of the oldest and most persistent powers of the ancient world. To understand Elam, it helps to forget the modern map for a while. Today we might think in terms of countries with borders, flags, passports, and airport security lines, where someone looks at your bag as if you personally invented inconvenience. But in the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era, the world was not arranged that way. Power moved along rivers, across deserts, through mountain passes, between cities, around temples and over trade routes. A kingdom could be strong in one century, fragmented in the next, and then return under a new dynasty with a different capital and a very confident king. Elam was not always a single neat state, with one centre and one continuous government. It was a cultural and political world spread across southwestern Iran, especially around the region of Susa and the lands stretching toward the Zagros. Its identity lasted through changes that would have exhausted a modern filing system. This is one reason Elam can feel slippery. Mesopotamia gives us names we can hold tightly: Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. Assyria. These names are not simple either, but they are familiar enough that we think we understand where they fit. Elam, by contrast, shifts in and out of the record. It appears in Mesopotamian texts as a land to the east, sometimes hostile, sometimes useful, sometimes defeated, sometimes dangerously strong. It appears in archaeology through cities, seals, tablets, pottery, monuments, and layers of occupation. It appears in its own inscriptions, though not always in forms that speak easily to us. And because it was both close to Mesopotamia and different from it, Elam often gets pulled into someone else's story, like a relative who keeps being introduced only as the neighbour of a more famous person. But Elam was not simply next door to civilization, it was civilization. It had cities of great age, especially Susa, which became one of the key urban centres of the ancient Near East. Susa stood in a rich plain near the foothills where the lowland world opened toward the plateau. That position mattered deeply. To the west lay Mesopotamia, with its dense networks of cities and canals. To the east and north lay highlands, with access to materials that lowland cities needed. Mesopotamia was brilliant at growing grain and building with mud brick, but it was poor in many raw materials. Stone, timber, metals and luxury goods often had to come from elsewhere. Elam stood along the routes to elsewhere. That alone made it important. Imagine a merchant in ancient Mesopotamia trying to obtain copper, tin, fine stone, timber or rare goods from distant lands. The journey does not simply happen across empty space. It passes through controlled routes, local rulers, tolls, alliances, dangers, and negotiations. Elamite regions could act as gateways between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, and beyond that, wider networks reaching towards Central Asia and the Indus world. This meant Elam was not just a political rival. It was part of the economic bloodstream of the ancient Near East. Goods moved through it. Ideas moved through it. Styles, technologies, scribal habits, religious symbols and political ambitions crossed its lands in both directions. If Mesopotamia was a great written engine, Elam was one of the landscapes that helped feed it, challenge it, and redirect it. The relationship between Elam and Mesopotamia was old, very old. Already in the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, the region around Susa was connected to the wider world of early urban development. Susa shows signs of deep interaction with southern Mesopotamia, but also a local character of its own. That is important, because contact does not mean imitation in the simple sense. Ancient societies borrowed constantly, but borrowing was not the same as surrendering identity. A seal design might travel, a writing system might influence another, a pottery style might be adapted. But local communities selected, transformed and reshaped what they received. Elam was not a mirror held up to Mesopotamia. It was more like a neighbouring house with some shared tools, some different rooms, and perhaps a few arguments over the fence. One of the earliest and most intriguing signs of Elam's distinctive path is the writing known as Proto-Elamite, used around the late 4th and early 3rd millennia before the Common Era. It remains only partly understood, which is a polite way of saying that it has been quietly frustrating scholars for a very long time. These tablets, found especially at Susa and other sites, show that people in the region were keeping records and organising economic life in ways that required notation. The signs look different from Mesopotamian cuneiform, and while the system may have been influenced by the broader invention of writing in the Near East, it developed along its own path. There is something wonderfully humbling about that. A person pressed signs into clay more than 5,000 years ago, probably to track goods, workers, animals or rations, and today some of those signs still sit before us with the calm confidence of a locked door. That locked door matters because writing changes how civilizations survive in memory. Mesopotamia left us huge archives that can be read in great detail. We can hear kings boast, merchants complain, students copy exercises, priests record rituals, and officials document everything from grain to goats. Elam left writing too, but the record is thinner and harder to interpret in places. That difference has shaped modern perception. We know Mesopotamia partly because Mesopotamia talked a lot, and because much of its talk was baked into durable clay. Elam talked too, but more of its voice has been lost, scattered, or preserved in scripts and languages that do not always yield easily. It is a reminder that historical fame is not always about importance. Sometimes it is about paperwork surviving in a form future people can understand. The people of Elam spoke Elamite, a language that does not fit neatly into the major language families around it. It was not Semitic like Akkadian, nor Sumerian, nor Indo-European like later Old Persian. It stands apart, and that alone gives Elam a strong sense of identity in the ancient landscape. Language is not just a tool for speaking, it carries habits of thought, administration, ritual, family, insult, affection, and all the small daily negotiations that make a society alive. We have only a limited view of Elamite compared with languages like Akkadian, but its persistence is striking. It continued to be used across long periods and later became one of the official languages of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. That is not a small afterlife. It means that even after Elam as an independent power had changed beyond recognition, the language and administrative traditions of Elam still mattered in the machinery of empire. Politically, Elam's history moved through several broad periods, with rulers and dynasties whose names can feel unfamiliar at first, but whose ambitions were perfectly recognizable. Like other ancient rulers, Elamite kings wanted legitimacy, wealth, divine favor, security, and the pleasure of being remembered as more successful than their enemies. Some ruled from Susa, while others were connected to highland centres such as Anshan. At different times, Elam was organised around multiple regions, and its rulers sometimes used titles that reflected this layered structure. The relationship between lowland Susa and highland Anshan would become especially important because Elam was not just one city with a surrounding countryside. It was a world linking ecological zones, each with its own resources and political weight. This connection between lowland and highland gave Elam resilience. A purely lowland kingdom might be vulnerable to invasion across the plain. A purely highland kingdom might be isolated from the trade and administrative systems of Mesopotamia. Elam had both faces. It could reach into the plain and retreat toward the mountains. It could participate in the world of Mesopotamian diplomacy and warfare, while drawing strength from roots and regions farther east. Of course, this did not make it invincible. No ancient kingdom was invincible, no matter how many inscriptions claim the gods had personally approved its military policy. But it gave Elam a flexibility that helped it survive through long centuries of pressure. And there was pressure. Mesopotamian rulers often looked east with hunger or anxiety. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon and his successors pushed into surrounding regions, and Elam came into their orbit. Later, kings of Ur, especially during the third dynasty of Ur, tried to control Elamite territories and extract tribute. These were not casual border disputes. Control of Elam meant access to resources, security against eastern rivals, and prestige. For Mesopotamian kings, claiming victory over Elam was a way of saying they had extended order beyond the river plains into the difficult lands beyond. For Elamite rulers, resisting or overturning such control was a way of asserting that the mountains and eastern plains were not simply prizes to be collected by Western kings. The collapse of the third dynasty of Ur is one of the moments when Elam steps dramatically into the Mesopotamian story. Around the end of the third millennium before the Common Era, Ur, one of the great cities of southern Mesopotamia, fell after a period of pressure, famine, invasion, and political breakdown. Elamite forces were involved in the final blow, and the last king of Ur, Ibbi-Sin, was taken away. Mesopotamian lamentations remembered the fall of Ur with grief, describing the city abandoned by its gods and overwhelmed by enemies. From the Mesopotamian point of view, Elam could appear as a destroyer from the east, but from another angle, this was Elam acting as a major regional power, able to intervene decisively in the fate of one of the greatest states of its age. That is the thing about ancient sources. They often preserve emotion as much as fact. A defeated city writes grief. A victorious king writes triumph. A frightened neighbour writes suspicion. If we only read Elam through Mesopotamian fear or resentment, we see a distorted image. It is a little like learning about someone entirely from the complaints of their rival at work. Useful, perhaps, but not exactly balanced. To understand Elam, we have to stand in between the sources and ask what kind of society could trouble Mesopotamia for so long. The answer is not a simple raiding people from the hills. The answer is a civilization with deep roots, urban centres, administrative systems, religious traditions, and a strategic place in the geography of the ancient world, religion in Elam also shows us a world with its own sacred structure. Elamite gods and goddesses were not just local versions of Mesopotamian deities, though there was certainly contact and overlap. The god in Shushinak, strongly associated with Susa, became one of the major divine figures of Elam. His name itself is connected with the city, and he appears as a protector and judge in Elamite religious life. Other deities, such as Napirisha and Kururusha, reveal a divine world that was complex, regionally varied, and deeply tied to kingship. In the ancient Near East, politics and religion were not separate compartments. A king's power needed divine support. A city's identity was bound to its gods. A temple was not just a place for worship. It was an economic, social, and political institution, the kind of place where heaven and administration met, which is perhaps less strange than it sounds when you remember how many ancient documents were basically sacred paperwork. Elamite sacred architecture included impressive sites, but one of the most extraordinary comes later, at Chogha Zanbil, built in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era by the Elamite king Napirisha. Its great ziggurat still stands as one of the most important surviving monuments of Elam. Although we will come closer to such temples and sacred places later, it is worth letting the image rest here for a moment. A huge step structure rising in southwestern Iran, not in Mesopotamia, not as a copy without meaning, but as part of Elam's own royal and religious world. It is a reminder that Elam was capable of monumental ambition. It did not merely look across the border at Mesopotamian temples and sigh wistfully. It built its own sacred landscapes. Elam's kings were also deeply involved in the politics of prestige. Like other rulers of the ancient Near East, they commissioned inscriptions, dedicated objects to gods, fought wars, made alliances, and sometimes took divine statues from enemy cities. One of the most famous episodes in Elamite history is the capture of the statue of the Babylonian god Marduk and other important monuments. The Stele of Hammurabi, the great law monument of Babylon, was eventually taken to Susa, where it was found thousands of years later. That detail is almost too perfect. One of the most famous artifacts of Mesopotamian civilization survived in the heart of Elamite territory because it had been carried there as war booty. History apparently has a very strange filing system. The movement of such objects tells us a great deal about power. In the ancient Near East, taking a monument or divine statue was not just looting in the simple sense. It was symbolic domination. It said that the defeated city's order had been overturned, that its god had been removed, that its king had failed. When Elamite rulers carried Mesopotamian monuments to Susa, they were not only collecting beautiful objects, they were writing their own authority onto the memory of their rivals, and ironically, by doing so, they preserved some of those objects for modern archaeologists. The ancient act of humiliation became a modern gift to museums, which is a very odd career path for a stone monument. This rivalry with Mesopotamia was not constant warfare. There were also periods of diplomacy, trade, intermarriage, and influence. Ancient neighbours could be enemies one decade and treaty partners the next. They could exchange gifts and then raid each other's borderlands with very little emotional contradiction. Royal politics had a flexible sense of friendship. Elam and Mesopotamia shared a long frontier of interaction, and this produced a mixed world. Mesopotamian scribal culture influenced Elam, especially through the use of cuneiform. Akkadian, the great diplomatic and administrative language of the region, was known in Elamite contexts. At the same time, Elamite culture influenced the broader region, especially through its political presence and long-term survival in southwestern Iran. The strength of Elam came partly from its ability to endure between larger imperial waves. The Akkadians rose and fell. The third dynasty of Ur rose and fell. Old Babylonian power shifted. Kassite Babylonia endured and changed. Assyria expanded with terrifying force. Through these transformations, Elam did not remain unchanged, but it remained present. Sometimes it emerged as a powerful kingdom. Sometimes it was fragmented. Sometimes it suffered defeat. but it was there again and again, like a mountain outline that disappears in haze and then returns when the light changes. This long endurance is one of the reasons Elam deserves more attention. Modern people often remember ancient history as a sequence of famous empires, but much of real history is made by regions that survive between empires. They absorb shocks, they preserve traditions, they serve as bridges, they become the ground from which later powers rise. Elam's lands would later be central to the Persian world. Anshan, one of the important Elamite regions, became connected to the early Persian royal line. Susa later became one of the capitals of the Achaemenid Empire. So when we speak of Elam, we are not speaking of a dead end. We are speaking of one of the deep foundations beneath later Iranian history. And yet, Elam's ancient power is easy to miss because its story does not fit the simple pattern people often expect. It was not always an empire in the Mesopotamian style. It did not leave behind a single famous king known to every school child. It did not become the central ancestor of Western historical imagination in the way Greece and Rome did. It did not leave pyramids towering over a tourist skyline. Much of its evidence is quieter: administrative tablets, broken inscriptions, burned levels, cylinder seals, names in enemy texts, a city mound layered with time. This quieter evidence demands a slower kind of attention. It asks us to value not only the loudest civilizations, but the ones that shaped history from the side. There is a useful comparison here with the geography itself. Mesopotamia is open, flat, riverine, visible. Its cities rose on plains where canals could bind communities together. Elam is more mixed, plain and mountain, lowland and highland, visible and hidden. It is fitting that its history feels the same way. Part of it lies in the open, directly connected to Mesopotamian records. Part of it withdraws into the plateau, harder to follow. To study Elam is to move between those zones, between what is documented and what is inferred, between what the clay tablet says and what the landscape suggests. It is ancient history, with one foot in a palace archive and the other on a mountain road. The people who lived in Elam would not have thought of themselves as forgotten. That is our problem, not theirs. They inhabited a world that made sense to them, with local loyalties, sacred obligations, political struggles, and daily routines. A farmer near Susa did not wake up wondering whether a future documentary would give Elam enough credit beside Mesopotamia. He probably wondered about water, harvest, taxes, family, and whether the people in charge would make life easier or harder this year. A scribe learning Elamite or Akkadian signs did not imagine that his practice tablet might one day become evidence in a modern discussion about civilization. He was likely more concerned with getting the signs correct and avoiding the ancient equivalent of a disappointed teacher's sigh. This is worth remembering because civilizations are not abstractions. Elam was not only kings and wars, it was households, fields, animals, crafts, markets, roads, shrines, food, illness, festivals, grief, and work. It was people who knew the smell of wet earth after irrigation, the weight of clay in the hand, the sound of animals in courtyards, the heat of the lowland sun, the sight of hills on the horizon. It was a lived world before it became a historical problem. And perhaps one of the gentlest ways to restore Elam is to imagine it not as a shadow of Mesopotamia, but as a place where ordinary life continued beneath the movements of kings. When we call Elam an ancient power beside Mesopotamia, we are really describing a relationship that lasted for generations beyond counting. Beside can sound peaceful, almost polite, like two neighbours sharing a garden wall. Sometimes it was that. Goods crossed, ideas crossed, scribes borrowed systems, rulers negotiated. But beside can also mean pressed against, competing with, refusing to disappear. Elam was beside Mesopotamia the way a rival city is beside another city, close enough that each must account for the other. It was a civilization that shaped the decisions of Western kings and carried its own ambitions east of the rivers. As we move farther into the story, Susa will become our great doorway. Through Susa, we can see Elam as a city, not only as a name. We can see the layers of settlement, the meeting of cultures, the rise of temples and administrations, the way a place can survive so long that it becomes almost a witness to history itself. Susa will show us how Elam stood at a crossroads, how it absorbed and resisted influences, how it became a prize for conquerors and a centre for kings. The ancient power beside Mesopotamia was not floating in the distance. It had streets, walls, sacred spaces and archives. It had a body, and Susa was one of its beating hearts. So for now, let the map settle in your mind. To the west, the famous riverlands of Mesopotamia, restless with cities and kings. To the east, the rising world of Elam, tied to mountains, plains and routes beyond the horizon. Between them, a long history of rivalry, exchange, fear, admiration and memory. Elam was not a footnote waiting politely at the bottom of the page. It was one of the forces that helped write the page in the first place. And as the night deepens and the ancient roads become a little clearer, we can begin to follow them towards Susa, the city where so many worlds met, and where the forgotten civilization beside Mesopotamia begins to feel less forgotten with every step. To understand Elam properly, we have to spend time with Susa, because Susa was not just a city in the ordinary sense. It was a meeting place, a survivor, a witness, and in many ways one of the great memory banks of the ancient Near East. Some cities rise quickly, burn brightly, and then vanish so completely that archaeology has to introduce them back to the world, like shy guests at a gathering. Susa did something different. It endured. It stayed important across thousands of years, through changing peoples, changing rulers, changing languages and changing empires. If ancient cities could develop a calm expression from having seen too much, Susa would probably have one. It stood in the region of Susiana, in what is now southwestern Iran, not far from the Great Plains that linked Elam with Mesopotamia, but also close enough to the foothills and roots of the Iranian plateau to look east as well as west. This position made Susa special from the beginning. It was not buried deep in a remote mountain valley, cut off from the wider world. It was not simply a lowland settlement tied only to river fields. It sat near a hinge in the landscape, where one world began to open into another. To the west were the cities of Mesopotamia, with their scribes, canals, temples, merchants and royal ambitions. To the east were routes leading toward highland communities, mineral zones, grazing lands and distant exchange networks. Susa was placed where messages, goods, styles, ideas, and sometimes armies could pass through. A city in such a location does not get to be boring for very long. Long before Elam became a political name that troubled Mesopotamian kings, Susa was already important. Its earliest layers reach back into the deep prehistoric and early urban periods, when settled life was becoming more complex, when communities were growing, organising labour, managing food, and finding new ways to express identity through pottery, seals, buildings, and ritual spaces. The city's long occupation means that archaeologists have found Susa not as one clean moment, but as a thick stack of moments. One layer lies over another, and beneath that, another, and beneath that, another still. This is the strange beauty of ancient cities. They do not simply occupy space, they accumulate time. Their streets are rebuilt, their walls are repaired, their temples are replaced, their old neighbourhoods are covered by new ones, and after enough centuries the city becomes almost geological, a human-made hill of memory. Susa's early culture shows both local creativity and contact with Mesopotamia. That balance is important. It would be too easy to imagine Susa as a kind of eastern reflection of Mesopotamian civilization, receiving ideas from the West and copying them obediently like a student trying not to upset a very strict teacher. But the evidence suggests something more interesting. Susa was connected to Mesopotamia, yes, especially during periods when southern Mesopotamian styles and administrative practices spread widely. Yet it also maintained its own patterns, its own regional identity, and its own place within the broader Elamite world. contact did not erase difference. It created a frontier of exchange where people borrowed, adapted, resisted, and transformed what they encountered. Think of Susa as a busy, ancient conversation. Not a conversation made only of words, but of clay seals, trade goods, building styles, religious symbols, writing systems, marriage alliances, diplomatic messages, tribute and war trophies. A merchant arriving from the west might bring textiles, grain, oil, or finished goods. Someone coming down from the highlands might bring stone, timber, livestock, metals, or raw materials that the river plains needed. Scribes might use signs and systems influenced by Mesopotamian practice, while local officials worked within Elamite structures of power. Priests served gods whose names and roles belonged to the sacred world of Elam, even as Mesopotamian religious ideas drifted in and out of the region. In Susa, the ancient world did not sit still. It crossed paths. The city was especially important because it connected the lowland plain with the larger Elamite landscape. Elam was never only Susa, but Susa was one of its most visible faces. It was the part of Elam most directly exposed to Mesopotamian influence and conflict. Because of that, Mesopotamian texts often mention Susa when speaking of Elamite power. To conquer Susa, to raid Susa, to take goods from Susa, or to install influence, there was to make a statement about control over the eastern neighbour. Yet Susa was not merely a prize to be taken. It was a centre with its own depth. It absorbed conquest, survived destruction, and rose again. That kind of endurance is hard to explain unless a city has more than walls. It needs geography, economy, sacred importance, and people willing to keep returning to it even after history has made a mess of the place, which history does with suspicious enthusiasm. One of the most fascinating things about Susa is the way it reveals the border between writing worlds. In early periods, the region produced Proto-Elamite tablets, those mysterious records whose signs still resist full understanding. These tablets suggest a society that needed accounting, administration, and organised systems of control. Someone was counting animals, goods, labour, or rations. Someone cared enough about numbers and categories to press marks into wet clay and store the result. It sounds ordinary, almost dull, until you realise that this is one of the great thresholds in human history. A community had become complex enough that memory alone was no longer sufficient. The human mind, excellent though it is, cannot always remember how many sheep belonged to which household, how much grain went where, and whether someone conveniently forgot to return a jar of oil. Clay, thankfully, has fewer excuses. The fact that Proto-Elamite remains difficult to read gives Susa a kind of quiet mystery. We're not looking at a silent society. We are looking at a society that spoke, counted, recorded, and organised itself, but whose early written voice comes to us through a system not fully unlocked. It is not silent because it had nothing to say. It is silent because the key is damaged. That is a very different thing, and in the slow work of archaeology and epigraphy, that distinction matters. A lost language or script is not an empty room. It is a room with the door still shut, and sometimes you can hear movement on the other side. Later, Susa became deeply involved with cuneiform traditions, especially as Elamite, Akkadian, and other administrative languages moved through the region. This makes the city a place where scripts and languages met. Writing was never just a neutral technology. It carried prestige, training, power, and habits of government. To write in one language rather than another could signal political allegiance, practical necessity, or cultural identity. A scribe in Susa might need to operate in a world where Elamite traditions and Mesopotamian systems overlapped. Such people were not simply clerks. They were cultural bridges, though probably also tired workers who wished clay tablets were a little less heavy and bureaucracy a little less immortal. Susa also became famous because some of the most remarkable Mesopotamian objects ever found were discovered there, not because they were made there originally, but because they had been carried there. The most famous example is the Stele of Hammurabi, the great monument bearing the Babylonian king's laws. It was found at Susa after being taken from Mesopotamia, likely as booty by an Elamite ruler. This fact is wonderfully revealing. The object most people associate with Babylon survived in Elamite territory because power had shifted, because one kingdom had reached into the symbolic heart of another and removed a monument of royal authority. It is as if a civilization took another civilization's framed certificate from the wall and hung it in its own palace. Not exactly subtle, but very effective. This habit of carrying off monuments and divine images was not random theft. In the ancient Near East, a monument had political life. A statue, stele, or sacred object, was tied to the authority of the king, the protection of the gods, and the identity of a city. When Elamite rulers took Mesopotamian objects to Susa, they were making visible claims about victory and dominance. They were bringing the memory of conquest into their own sacred and royal spaces. For modern archaeologists, this has created unexpected layers of history. Susa became not only a centre of Elamite culture, but also a storehouse of displaced Mesopotamian memory. The city held its own past and, quite literally in some cases, pieces of other people's pasts as well. But we should be careful not to see Susa only through objects taken from elsewhere. That would repeat the old mistake of letting Mesopotamia dominate the story. Susa was important in its own right. It had local religious traditions, local elites, local crafts, and a long Elamite identity. The god Shushanak, whose name is closely connected to Susa, held a major place in the city's sacred life. He was not just a minor local figure tucked into the corner of a temple. He was a powerful deity associated with protection, judgment, and the city itself. In the ancient world, the bond between a city and its god could be as meaningful as the bond between a people and their land. A city's god was not decorative. The god was part of what made the city itself. Imagine approaching Susa in one of its strong periods. The landscape around it is warm, worked, and lived in. Fields spread where irrigation and seasonal water make agriculture possible. People move along roads and tracks, bringing goods toward the city. Mud brick walls and buildings rise from the plain, not gleaming white like marble temples in a later Mediterranean imagination, but earthy, practical, sun-baked, repaired and expanded over time. There are storage areas, workshops, shrines, official spaces, houses, courtyards, and places where animals, people, dust, smoke, and conversation fill the day. Ancient cities were not clean museum models. They were noisy, crowded, fragrant in ways we may not want to investigate too deeply, and full of human business. Somewhere in Susa, scribes prepare tablets. Somewhere, offerings are brought to a temple. Somewhere, merchants argue over weights, measures, and quality, because human beings have been arguing over fair prices since roughly the moment we invented trade. Somewhere, a child watches a craftsman press a seal into clay and sees authority appear as an image. Somewhere else, an official receives news from the west, perhaps from Babylonia, perhaps from a border zone, perhaps from a ruler whose friendly tone in a letter does not quite hide the possibility of war. In a city like Susa, life at every scale is connected. A royal decision might affect a farmer, a caravan route might affect a temple, a storm in the highlands might affect prices in the market. The ancient world was not simple because it was old. It was complicated in very human ways. The city's craftsmanship also deserves attention. Susa and the broader Elamite world produced beautiful seals, pottery, metalwork, and architectural elements. Cylinder seals in particular give us tiny, detailed windows into ancient imagination and administration. A seal could be rolled across clay to mark ownership, identity, or approval. These objects were practical tools, but also miniature works of art. Their images could show animals, humans, divine figures, mythological scenes, and symbols of authority. The person carrying a seal carried a kind of portable signature, a small object that could speak in official contexts. In a world without modern paperwork, seals made trust visible. Of course, they also created new opportunities for fraud, loss, and administrative panic, because no technology has ever solved all human problems at once. Susa's role as a meeting place also meant that its art and material culture could shift over time. Influences from Mesopotamia appeared, but so did features tied to Iranian traditions and local Elamite preferences. This blending should not be imagined as confusion. It was the normal life of a crossroads. Border cities often become fluent in more than one cultural language. They know how to speak to outsiders while keeping their own habits. They can adopt foreign forms for diplomacy, trade, or prestige while preserving local meanings underneath. Susa's identity was not weakened by contact. In many ways, it was built through contact. The political history of Susa was not always peaceful. The city was attacked, taken, rebuilt, and fought over across different periods. Mesopotamian rulers who wanted to dominate Elam often focused on Susa because it was accessible and symbolically important. Elamite rulers likewise used Susa as a base of power and display. This gave the city a certain vulnerability. It stood close enough to Mesopotamia to benefit from contact, but also close enough to be struck by armies coming from the west. Geography is generous like that. It gives a city opportunity with one hand and danger with the other. Yet Susa's ability to survive repeated upheaval is one of its most impressive qualities. Some cities never recover from destruction. Others return because their location remains too valuable to abandon. Susa belonged to the second kind. Even after periods of violence or decline, people came back. They rebuilt. They reused old spaces. They placed new authority over old foundations, and each rebuilding added another layer to the city's long biography. It's easy to talk about ancient ruins as if they are dead places, but ruins often mark the opposite. They mark places people cared about enough to remake again and again. Susa's later importance under the Persian Empire also grew from these deep roots. When the Achaemenid kings made Susa one of their great capitals, they were not choosing an empty stage. They were building on a city already heavy with prestige. The Persian royal palaces at Susa belong to a later story, but they remind us that Elamite lands did not fade into irrelevance. The old Elamite region became part of one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Elamite language continued in administrative use. Local traditions were folded into imperial systems. The city that had once stood as a key centre of Elam became an imperial capital where people, materials, and artistic styles from across the empire came together. In that sense, Susa's identity as a meeting place did not end with Elam. It expanded. This makes Susa one of the rare cities where you can follow a long thread from early urban development to Elamite power to Persian empire. That is not a small span. It is almost dizzying if you pause over it too long. A single place, occupied and reoccupied, important under different names and rulers, holding within it the memories of prehistoric communities, Elamite kings, Mesopotamian conflicts and Persian grandeur. We often divide history into neat periods because our minds need shelves. Early Bronze Age here, Middle Elamite there, Neo-Elamite over there, Achaemenid later on. Susa ignores our shelves. It keeps everything in the same long cabinet and lets us sort through it carefully, one layer at a time. In this way, Susa helps us understand what civilization really means. Not just monuments, not just kings, not just writing. Civilization is continuity and adaptation. It is the ability of people to organize life in a place, to create institutions, to pass down habits, to absorb shocks, and to keep making meaning even when the political weather changes. Susa did that for a very long time. It was Elamite, but it was also more than any single label. It was local and international, sacred and administrative, vulnerable and resilient. It was a city where the ancient world met itself, and because Susa was so connected, it forces us to rethink the boundary between Elam and Mesopotamia. Boundaries existed, of course. People knew when they were dealing with outsiders. Languages differed, rulers fought, gods had local homes, but the border was not a wall, it was a zone of interaction. Mesopotamian goods and ideas entered Elam. Elamite power entered Mesopotamian politics. Objects crossed by trade, tribute, marriage, diplomacy and conquest. The two worlds were distinct, but braided together. Like two threads pulled through the same loom, they kept their colours but formed a shared pattern. This matters because modern storytelling often prefers isolated civilizations. It is simpler to say that one civilization invented this, another built that, another conquered something else, as if the ancient world were a collection of separate rooms. But Susa shows us corridors. It shows us movement. It shows us that early civilizations were deeply aware of each other. They competed, copied, admired, feared, and needed one another. Mesopotamia needed access to resources beyond its plains. Elam needed access to trade, prestige, and political engagement with its western neighbour. Neither existed in a vacuum, though if they had, someone would certainly have tried to tax it. The people of Susa lived at the centre of these exchanges, but not necessarily with the grand historical awareness we give them now. To them, this was everyday life. A foreign object in the market was not evidence of cultural interaction for a future museum label. It was something to buy, sell, use, admire, or repair. A tablet written in a particular language was not a thrilling clue for future scholars. It was a record that needed to be accurate. A temple ritual was not a data point in comparative religion. It was a sacred duty. This is one of the tender challenges of ancient history. We turn lives into evidence, but those lives were first just lives. And what lives they must have been. Morning light over mud brick walls, heat rising from the plain, the sound of tools in workshops, the smell of bread, animals, oil, smoke, and river mud. Voices in more than one language, officials passing through gates, priests tending sacred spaces, traders arriving with tired animals and carefully guarded goods, children playing near walls that already stood on older walls, elders remembering a flood, a war, a bad harvest, a good king, a terrible official, or a story about the city's god. Susa was not only a point on a map. It was a living place where the vast movements of history became ordinary days. The city also teaches us that memory is uneven. Susa was famous in antiquity, but for many modern people it is far less familiar than Babylon, Nineveh, or Persepolis. Yet it touched all of those worlds in different ways. It was connected to Mesopotamian history through war and captured monuments. It was central to Elamite identity. It became important in Persian imperial rule. It held layers that bridge early urbanism and later empire. If we measure a city by how many eras it helped connect, Susa deserves a very high place. It was not just where civilizations met, it was where they left fingerprints on each other. As we continue into Elam's story, Susa gives us a firm place to stand. From here, the ancient power of Elam becomes more concrete. We are no longer speaking only of a land to the east, or a name that appears in Mesopotamian records. We are standing in a city with deep roots, sacred authority, administrative life, artistic production, and political weight. We can see why Elam could rival Mesopotamia, because it was not a vague highland threat. It had centres capable of gathering wealth, organising power, and projecting identity. Susa was one of those centres, and its long life made Elam visible across the centuries. But Susa was not the whole of Elam. Beyond the city, the land rose toward other sacred and political places. Elamite kings did not draw strength only from the lowland plain. Their authority reached into highland regions and was tied to temples, gods, dynasties, and landscapes that gave their rule a deeper foundation. To understand Elamite power, we need to move from the city where civilizations met toward the places where kings claimed divine support, where temples rose from earth and brick, and where the sacred heights of Elam gave shape to a civilization that was far more than a neighbour of Mesopotamia. To move from Susa into the wider world of Elam is to leave behind the idea that ancient power lived only in city walls, palaces and scribal rooms. Those things mattered, of course. A king without a palace could still be a king, but he would probably feel the lack of proper architecture when important visitors arrived. In Elam, power also rose from the land itself. It came from the plains around Susa, from the routes leading into the highlands, from old sacred places, from temples where gods received offerings, and from royal titles that joined together regions that were not always easy to hold. Elam was a civilization of both lowland and mountain, and its kings had to speak to both. This is one of the most important things to understand about Elamite kingship. It was not simply a copy of Mesopotamian kingship placed slightly farther east. Elamite rulers lived close enough to Mesopotamia to understand its royal language of conquest, temple building, divine favour, and inscriptions. They used some similar tools of authority because those tools worked across the ancient Near East. But their world was shaped by a different geography and a different cultural inheritance. Elamite power had to connect Susa with the highlands, the plains with the plateau, and local sacred traditions with the practical demands of ruling. That was not always simple. Ancient kings liked to present themselves as calm masters of everything, but the truth was usually messier, involving alliances, rival nobles, difficult roads, seasonal pressures, and the ongoing problem of people not doing exactly what the palace wanted. The title of some Elamite rulers gives us a clue to this layered world. In certain periods, rulers used titles that linked Susa and Anshan, and sometimes referred to a broader authority over Elamite lands. Anshan was especially important in the highlands of Fars, and it would later become deeply connected with the early Persian royal line. But before that later story, Anshan belonged to the Elamite world, and its connection with Susa reveals that Elamite kingship stretched across more than one ecological zone. The king was not only a ruler of a single city. He claimed authority over a landscape of plains, mountains, routes, and sacred centres. That claim was powerful but also demanding. To rule Elam meant holding together places that were connected, but not identical. Susa gave Elam a face toward Mesopotamia. Anshan and the highland regions gave it depth. This combination helped Elam endure for so long. A ruler who controlled only Susa might be vulnerable to Western pressure from Mesopotamian states. A ruler who controlled only the highlands might lack access to the lowland wealth, diplomacy, and administrative networks that made Susa so important. Together these worlds gave Elam flexibility. It could reach toward Mesopotamia and retreat toward the mountains. It could trade, raid, defend, rebuild, and reappear after defeat. That kind of survival does not happen by accident. It depends on political structures that can bend without immediately breaking, though they may creak loudly while doing so. Elamite kingship was also tied closely to religion. In the ancient Near East, kings did not present themselves as ordinary administrators who happened to have a very nice chair. Their authority was sacred. They built temples, restored shrines, dedicated objects, called upon gods, and described their victories as signs of divine favour. This was not just public relations, though there was certainly plenty of public relations involved. The king's relationship with the gods was central to how order was imagined. If the gods supported the ruler, then the land could prosper. If the ruler failed, if the gods withdrew, if enemies entered the city, then people could understand catastrophe as more than politics. It became a cosmic problem. In Elam, the divine world had its own character. One of the most important deities was Inshushinak, closely associated with Susa. His name itself is often understood as connected to the city, and he appears as a major god of protection and judgment. To speak of Susa without Inshushinak is almost to speak of a body without its breath. He was part of what made the city sacred. Elamite rulers honoured him, and his temple was a place where royal authority and divine presence met. When a king built or restored a temple for Inshushinak, he was not merely improving religious infrastructure. He was strengthening the bond between the city, the god, and the throne. But Elam's religious world extended beyond Susa. Deities such as Naparisha and Kirarisha held major roles, especially in the highland and broader Elamite landscape. Naparisha, whose name has been interpreted in connection with greatness or divinity, became an important god associated with Anshan and the highlands. Kirarisha, often understood as a great goddess, also held a powerful place in Elamite devotion. These divine figures remind us that Elamite religion was not centered on a single city alone. It reflected the wider geography of the civilization. The sacred order of Elam reached across regions, and its kings had to honor that spread if they wanted their rule to feel legitimate. This is where temples become more than buildings. A temple was not simply a place where people prayed quietly and then went home. In the ancient Near East, temples were economic centers, landholders, storehouses, employers, ritual sites, and symbols of collective identity. They organized offerings, received goods, supported priests and workers, and formed part of the administrative life of the city. A temple could own land, manage labor, and anchor a community's sense of protection. In a place like Elam, where political authority had to connect different regions, temples helped create sacred geography. They told people where power belonged, which gods watched over which places, and how rulers placed themselves within that divine landscape. The greatest surviving symbol of Elamite sacred ambition is Chogha Zanbil, the monumental complex built by the Elamite king Untashnaparisha in the 13th century before the Common Era. Its ancient name was Dur-Untash, meaning something like the town or fortress of Untash. It was not just a temple in a busy old city. It was a planned sacred centre, built with intention, scale, and royal confidence. At its heart rose a great ziggurat, a stepped temple tower made of brick dedicated to major Elamite gods, especially in Shushinak and Napirisha. Even today, in its ruined state, it is one of the most powerful reminders that Elam was capable of building on a scale that deserves to stand beside the better-known monuments of Mesopotamia. Chogha Zanbil is especially striking because it shows Elamite kingship trying to bind together lowland and highland sacred traditions. A temple complex honouring both Inshushinak of Susa and Napirisha of Anshan was not just a religious project. It was political theology in brick. It said that the king stood between these sacred powers. It said that Elam was not only Susa, not only Anshan, but a wider world that could be brought together under divine protection. Of course, building such a place was also a very kingly way of saying, "Please notice how important I am." Ancient rulers were subtle in some ways and spectacularly unsubtle in others. A giant ziggurat in the landscape leans toward the second category. The bricks of Chogha Zanbil carried inscriptions. That detail matters. A building could speak through its materials. Each inscribed brick repeated royal names and dedications, creating a kind of written skin for the monument. The king's devotion became part of the wall itself. This practice was common in the ancient Near East, but it has a special intimacy when imagined carefully. A worker shaped the brick. A sign was stamped or written. The brick dried or was fired. It was placed into a structure meant to honour gods and preserve a king's name. Thousands of years later, the brick may be broken, weathered, or displaced, but the intention remains. The king wanted memory to cling to the building. In some cases it did. Chogha Zanbil also reminds us that Elamite sacred places were not merely imitations of Mesopotamian ziggurats. There were shared architectural ideas across the region, but the complex had its own Elamite meaning. The gods, the royal program, the location, and the political message were rooted in Elam's specific world. It is tempting, especially when speaking about civilizations near Mesopotamia, to treat every stepped tower as proof of Mesopotamian influence and stop there. Influence is real, but it is not the whole explanation. Cultures do not borrow forms like empty boxes. They fill them with their own meanings. Chogha Zanbil was Elamite because it served Elamite gods, Elamite kingship, and Elamite sacred geography. The choice to build a new sacred city was itself ambitious. Most rulers restored old temples because old temples carried long prestige. To build a new centre was a different kind of statement. Untash Napirisha seemed to be creating a place where divine authority and royal authority could be gathered, organised, and displayed. It may have been an attempt to unify the religious life of the kingdom, or at least to create a royal sanctuary that symbolically joined its major regions. Like many large royal projects, it was both devotion and strategy. A king might genuinely honour the gods while also understanding that a huge temple complex is excellent for reminding everyone who commands the labour force. Labour is easy to overlook when we admire monuments. A ziggurat does not rise because a king has a dramatic idea and points at the horizon. It rises because people quarry or prepare materials, shape bricks, move loads, carry water, manage food supplies, organise teams, record deliveries, solve problems, and repeat exhausting tasks for years. Behind every ancient monument is a large number of people who probably had sore backs and very practical opinions about royal ambition. Chogha Zanbil, like all great sacred architecture, is therefore both a religious symbol and a record of organised labour. It shows not only belief but administration, not only piety but logistics. The gods may have received the temple, but human hands built every inch of it. Elamite kings also used temple building to restore order after conflict. This was common across the ancient Near East. A ruler who repaired a shrine could present himself as a restorer of proper relations between gods and people. A king who dedicated objects could show gratitude and loyalty. A temple inscription might say, in effect, that the king has done what is right, that the god has favoured him, and that the land is under protection. This kind of language was not simply decorative. It shaped how people understood kingship. A ruler was expected to maintain the divine world materially. If roofs collapsed, offerings failed, or sacred objects were neglected, that was not just bad maintenance. It could be read as disorder at the heart of society. The sacred heights of Elam were not always literal mountains, though mountains mattered deeply in its geography. The phrase also points to the way sacred authority rose above ordinary politics. Elamite rulers were involved in the same brutal world as other ancient kings, with raids, treaties, dynastic struggles, and military campaigns, but they framed their actions within a sacred order. A victory was not only a victory, it was proof that the gods had supported the king. A temple was not only a building, it was a visible bond between heaven, land, and royal duty. A city god was not only a local tradition, he was part of the identity and protection of the urban community. That does not mean everyone always believed royal claims exactly as written. Ancient people were not simple. They understood politics. They knew kings could fail. They knew famine, invasion, and bad decisions did not become pleasant just because an inscription sounded confident. But religious kingship gave people a language for order and crisis. When a city fell, people could ask which god had turned away. When a king succeeded, he could thank the god and increase offerings. In such a world, temple life and political life were woven together so tightly that separating them too sharply can make the past harder to understand. The royal families of Elam moved through long and sometimes complicated dynastic histories. Names such as Puzur in Shushinak, Shilhak in Shushinak, Untash Napirisha, Shutruk Nahunte, and others belong to different periods of Elamite power, and each one stands within a world of shifting politics. Some expanded Elamite influence, some built or restored sacred places, some fought Mesopotamian rivals, some left inscriptions that reveal how they wanted to be remembered. These names may feel unfamiliar at first, but they deserve patience. Familiarity is often just repetition wearing a comfortable coat. The kings of Elam were once known, feared, praised, and served by real people. Their names sounded powerful in courts and temples long before modern readers had to slow down and pronounce them carefully. Puzur in Shushinak, for example, is one of the early rulers associated with Susa and Elamite authority during the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. His inscriptions show a ruler operating in a world deeply connected with Mesopotamian political styles, while also asserting local power. He used titles and language that reveal ambition, and his reign belongs to a period when the relationship between Akkadian influence and Elamite identity was especially important. A ruler like this stands at a crossroads of political tradition. He was not simply a local chieftain, nor a Mesopotamian king in disguise. He belonged to the complex borderland where power was translated between cultures. Later rulers, especially in the Middle Elamite period, brought Elamite power to some of its most impressive heights. Untashnapirisha built Chogha Zanbil. Shutruk-Nahunte and his successors projected Elamite strength into Babylonia and brought famous monuments back to Susa. Shilak in Shushinak left inscriptions that speak of building, conquest and devotion. These kings show Elam not as a passive neighbour, but as a state capable of serious military, religious and architectural ambition. Their world was one in which a ruler could honour Elamite gods, fight Babylonian enemies, build monumental sanctuaries, and claim a place among the great powers of the age. At the same time, kingship in Elam was not always centralised in a simple way. The relationship between different regions and branches of royal authority could be complex. Some titles suggest shared or hierarchical arrangements that may not fit easily into later models of monarchy. This complexity is not a weakness in the history. It is part of what makes Elam distinctive. We should not expect every ancient civilization to organise power in the same tidy pattern. Elam's political structure reflected its geography and traditions. Lowland cities, highland centres, royal families, local elites, temples, and external pressures all shaped the form kingship took. Temples help stabilise this complexity by placing royal authority within a sacred framework. If a king could present himself as chosen, supported, or beloved by major gods across the Elamite world, then his rule could appear larger than any one city or faction. A temple to Inshushinak at Susa tied him to the lowland sacred centre. A dedication to Naparisha tied him to highland authority. A monumental complex that honoured both helped claim unity across difference. This was not merely symbolic. Symbols are powerful because people act through them. A crown, a seal, a temple, a divine name, an inscription, a procession, all of these helped organise loyalty and memory. We should also imagine the ceremonies that made these places alive. A temple was not only a still building under the sun, it had movement. Priests entered sacred spaces, offerings were prepared, animals may have been sacrificed. Food, drink, oil, incense, textiles, and precious objects moved through ritual systems. Music may have accompanied ceremonies. Processions may have carried divine images or royal offerings. Festivals would have drawn people into shared rhythms of sacred time. These events reminded communities that the gods were present and that the king had duties toward them. The temple made the invisible order visible again and again. For ordinary people, the sacred world of Elam may have been felt in practical ways. A farmer might depend on divine favour for harvests. A mother might offer a prayer for a child. A craftsman might dedicate a small object. A local official might swear by a god. A soldier might march under the belief that the king's god stood behind the campaign. Religion was not a separate Sunday compartment, to use a modern image that does not quite fit. It was woven into law, work, family, agriculture, kingship, and the fear of uncertainty. The gods were part of the weather of life. The mountain dimension of Elam adds another layer to this sacred world. Across the ancient Near East, mountains often carried divine significance. They rose above ordinary land, touched the sky, and seemed to belong to a realm closer to gods. Even in Mesopotamia, where natural mountains were scarce in the southern plains, ziggurats may be understood partly as artificial sacred heights. Elam, with access to actual highlands, had a landscape where height and sacred meaning could come together naturally. The relationship between lowland temples and highland gods gave Elam a religious geography that was both grounded and elevated. This may be why Elam can feel different from Mesopotamia even when the two shared forms and practices. Mesopotamian cities often centered their sacred architecture in the flatness of the plain. building upward with mud brick toward the divine. Elam had plains too, and it built ziggurats too, but it also looked toward mountains and highland centres as part of its identity. Its sacred heights were not only constructed, some were built into the land. A civilization shaped by both Susa and Anshan, both in Shushinak and Naparisha, both plain and plateau, carried a different sense of space. The gods of Elam also reveal how deeply local identity mattered. In Shushinak was not interchangeable with a Mesopotamian god simply because both worlds had temples and kings. Naparisha was not just another divine name in a regional list. Kirarisha was not a decorative goddess placed at the edge of the system. These deities had relationships to places, rulers, and rituals. Their importance rose and shifted across time. Elamite religion had its own internal history, much of which we can only partly reconstruct. Like so much about Elam, the surviving evidence invites us closer but does not give us everything. It leaves spaces where careful imagination must remain disciplined, not running ahead of the evidence, but not refusing to see life behind it either. Royal inscriptions from Elamite rulers often speak in the expected language of ancient kings. They dedicate, conquer, restore, build, and ask the gods to preserve their names. This desire to preserve a name is deeply human. Kings had more resources than ordinary people to attempt it, but the impulse is familiar: to be remembered, to have one's work outlast the body, to leave a mark that says, "I was here, I built this, I served the god, I ruled this land." In Elam, as elsewhere, the temple became a machine of memory. It stored the king's name in brick, stone, metal, and ritual. Whether the gods needed the reminder is another question, but future archaeologists certainly did. And yet, for all their ambition, Elamite kings lived under the same rule as everyone else. Time wore down their walls, enemies damaged their cities, later rulers reused their materials, languages changed, temples fell silent, the great sacred centres lost their original rhythms. Chogha Zanbil, which must once have been a place of ceremony, labour and royal pride, became ruin. But ruin is not the same as disappearance. A ruin is a form of memory that has changed shape. It no longer functions as it once did, but it still speaks. Sometimes a broken temple tells us more powerfully about ancient devotion than a perfectly restored building could, because the break reminds us how far the message has travelled. The sacred heights of Elam therefore show us a civilization trying to bind together land, gods, and kingship across centuries. Susa brought one kind of authority. Anshan and the highlands brought another. Temples gave these regions sacred form. Kings built, dedicated, and conquered in the names of gods whose power made rule meaningful. The result was a world that could stand beside Mesopotamia without disappearing into it. It shared the ancient Near Eastern language of divine kingship, but spoke it with an Elamite accent. As we leave the temples and royal sanctuaries for now, the political edge of the story begins to sharpen. A civilization with kings, gods, cities, and sacred centres does not remain quietly beside a powerful neighbour forever. Elam and Mesopotamia watched each other across the borderlands for thousands of years, sometimes trading, sometimes negotiating, and sometimes marching into each other's histories with weapons, stolen monuments, and wounded pride. The next part of the journey turns toward that long rivalry, where Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon found that the power east of the rivers was not a distant shadow, but a force strong enough to change the fate of cities. The rivalry between Elam and Mesopotamia was not a brief quarrel between neighbours who disagreed over a border and then politely returned to their own gardens. It was one of the long, repeating tensions of the ancient Near East, a relationship made from trade, fear, admiration, invasion, tribute, diplomacy, revenge, and the constant awareness that the land just beyond the horizon could never be ignored. To the west, the cities of Mesopotamia rose along their rivers, wealthy and crowded, full of scribes, priests, merchants, kings, and canals that needed constant attention. rather like a very ancient version of managing group chats, except with more mud brick and fewer emojis. To the east, Elam stood across the plains and foothills, connected to mountains, resources and routes that Mesopotamia needed. The two worlds were close enough to know each other well, but different enough to distrust each other often. This rivalry began in the earliest periods of recorded history, when southern Mesopotamia was still dominated by Sumerian city-states. Sumer was not one kingdom at first, but a landscape of cities, each proud of its gods, walls, fields, temples and rulers. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur and others competed for land, water, prestige and divine favour. Their world was turned toward the rivers, because the rivers made agriculture possible, but the rivers did not give them everything. Southern Mesopotamia lacked many raw materials. Good stone was scarce. Timber had to be brought from elsewhere. Metals came from distant lands. Luxury goods travelled along trade routes that reached far beyond the alluvial plain. And to reach many of those resources, Mesopotamia had to look east, toward the regions connected with Elam. So Elam was never merely a distant enemy. It was part of Mesopotamia's survival system. Goods passed through Elamite lands or through networks Elam could influence. That gave Elam power even before armies were involved. A civilization that controls access to important materials can shape the politics of a region without always needing to raise a sword. It can tax, negotiate, block, redirect, or become the partner everyone complains about but still needs. Mesopotamian cities may have been famous for writing and urban life, but they depended on wider exchange. Elam sat along one of the important edges of that exchange, and edges are often where history becomes interesting. The earliest records from Mesopotamia already show awareness of lands to the east. Names shift, regions are described differently across time, and the exact political map is not always easy to reconstruct, but the pattern is clear. Mesopotamian rulers looked toward Elamite and neighbouring Iranian regions as places of both opportunity and danger. They wanted access to materials and trade, but they also feared the power of highland and eastern groups. From the Mesopotamian perspective, Elam could be a supplier one moment and a threat the next. From the Elamite perspective, Mesopotamia was rich, influential, and often annoyingly convinced that it had a natural right to dominate everything within reach. This is the rhythm we see again and again. Mesopotamian states expand eastward. Elam resists, adapts, or sometimes falls under outside control. Then Mesopotamian power weakens, and Elam reasserts itself, sometimes pushing westward in return. The frontier between them was not fixed like a modern border fence. It was a living zone of pressure. Political control moved back and forth across it, and with each movement came new claims, new grievances, and new inscriptions explaining why the gods had definitely supported whichever king had won most recently. During the rise of Akkad, this relationship became more intense. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad in the 24th century before the Common Era, was one of the first great territorial empires in world history. It united much of Mesopotamia under a powerful dynasty and projected force far beyond the old Sumerian city-state world. Sargon and his successors did not simply want to rule a city, or even a region. They wanted to command a wider world, and that meant looking toward Elam. The Akkadian kings campaigned in the east, claimed victories over Elamite lands, and tried to bring the roots and resources of that region under their influence. For Akkad, Elam was both a prize and a problem. A prize because controlling Elam meant access to wealth, prestige, and strategic depth. A problem because Elam was not easy to hold. Its geography worked against simple conquest. The lowland regions could be reached from Mesopotamia, but the highlands gave Elam depth and refuge. A western army could march in, win battles, take cities, and claim tribute, but long-term control was another matter. Mountain routes, local elites, distance from the Akkadian centre, and the sheer difficulty of governing a mixed landscape made domination fragile. Ancient empires often discovered that conquering a place was the exciting part. Administering it afterward was where the headaches began. Under Naram Sin, the famous Akkadian ruler and grandson of Sargon, imperial power reached an impressive height. Naram Sin presented himself with extraordinary confidence, even taking divine status in his royal image. He campaigned widely and left behind monuments proclaiming his victories. Elam appears within this wider imperial world, sometimes under Akkadian pressure and sometimes as part of diplomatic arrangements. There is evidence of agreements and political relations between Akkad and Elamite rulers, showing that the relationship was not simply one of endless battlefield violence. Even powerful kings had to negotiate. A treaty could be as useful as an army, and usually required fewer sandals. But the Akkadian Empire did not last forever. Like many early empires, it strained under the weight of distance, rebellion, environmental stress, and political instability. As Akkadian power weakened, regions that had been controlled or influenced by Akkad began to reassert themselves. Elam was one of the places where local power could rise again. This is a recurring feature of Elamite history. It could be pressed down by a great Mesopotamian state, but not easily erased. When the pressure lifted, Elam returned to the stage, sometimes with surprising force. One of the early Elamite rulers who stands out in this shifting world is Puzur-Inshushinak, associated with Susa in the period after Akkadian dominance. His reign shows a ruler operating in the space between Mesopotamian influence and Elamite independence. He used inscriptions and royal claims in ways that show his awareness of the wider political language of the region, but he was not simply an Akkadian official continuing someone else's project. He represented local authority rising again in Susa. His name, connected with the god Inshushinak, places him firmly within the sacred identity of the city. He helps us see how Elamite power could absorb outside influence, and then turn it into something local, something rooted in its own divine and political world. Then came the rise of the third dynasty of Ur, often called Ur III, one of the great Mesopotamian states after the collapse of Akkad. The kings of Ur built a highly organised kingdom with strong administration, heavy record-keeping, and a style of rule that reached across southern Mesopotamia and beyond. If bureaucracy could wear a crown, Ur III would have fitted it carefully, and then written down the measurements. The state produced enormous numbers of administrative tablets, recording labour, grain, animals, deliveries and obligations in astonishing detail. It was a society that trusted clay tablets the way modern offices trust spreadsheets, which is to say, perhaps a little too much, but with impressive commitment. The kings of Ur also tried to control Elamite territories. They campaigned eastward, installed officials, demanded tribute, and treated parts of Elam as subject lands. For a time, Mesopotamian power again pressed strongly into the east, but once more control was unstable. Elamite regions were not passive. Local dynasties and groups continued to matter, and the relationship between Ur and Elam was full of tension. The state of Ur could claim order, but the east remained difficult to manage. The fall of Ur is one of the most dramatic moments in this long rivalry. Around the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, Ur suffered under famine, pressure from Amorite groups, internal weakening, and attacks from the east. Elamite forces, especially associated with the Shemashki dynasty, helped bring down the final king, Ibi-Sin. He was captured and taken away, and the great city of Ur, once a centre of power and royal confidence, was left devastated. Mesopotamian laments remembered this event with deep sorrow. They described the city abandoned by its gods, its streets empty, its temple violated, its people suffering. The fall of Ur became not just a political event, but a trauma preserved in literature. From the Mesopotamian viewpoint, Elam appeared as a destroyer. The enemy from the east had helped bring disaster to one of the greatest cities of the age. But from the Elamite side, this was a moment of reversal. After periods of Mesopotamian pressure and control, Elam and its allies had struck back. A state that had tried to dominate the east had collapsed, and its king had been carried away. This does not make the suffering less real. Ancient wars were brutal, and the pain of the people of Ur was not a literary decoration, but it does remind us that history changes depending on where we stand. A catastrophe in one city can be remembered as liberation, revenge, or opportunity in another. After Ur's fall, Mesopotamia entered a new political landscape. Amorite dynasties rose in different cities. Esan and Lhasa became important. Eventually Babylon, once a relatively modest city, grew into a major power. Elam remained part of this world of shifting alliances and rivalries. During the early second millennium before the Common Era, Elamite rulers were involved in Mesopotamian politics not only through war, but through diplomacy and influence. They could support one city against another, intervene in disputes, and shape events across the border. This was not the behaviour of a marginal people, it was the behaviour of a major regional power acting within a complicated international system. The rise of Babylon under Hammurabi in the 18th century before the Common Era brought another famous Mesopotamian name into the Elamite story. Hammurabi is often remembered for his law stele, but he was also a skilled political operator and military ruler. Before he became the dominant king of southern Mesopotamia, he navigated a world of alliances and threats involving powerful neighbours, including Elam. At one point, Elamite power played a major role in the politics of the region, and Babylon had to respond carefully. Hammurabi's eventual success was not inevitable. He rose in a world where Elam, Mari, Lhasa, Eshnuna and other powers all mattered. The map was crowded, and everyone on it seemed to have an army, an ambition, and probably a scribe ready to explain why their cause was righteous. Babylon's relationship with Elam continued across the centuries. Sometimes Babylonian rulers fought Elam. Sometimes Elam invaded Babylonia. Sometimes Elamite kings carried off sacred objects and royal monuments. The most famous symbol of this is the stele of Hammurabi itself, which was found at Susa after being taken there as booty centuries after Hammurabi's reign. That journey is almost a perfect emblem of the rivalry. Babylon produced a monument of royal law and order. Elam later seized it and brought it to Susa as a sign of victory. Modern people found it there and placed it in the story of Mesopotamian civilization, while its presence in Elamite territory quietly reminds us that Babylon was not always the one in control. This act of carrying away monuments had deep meaning. In the ancient Near East, power was visible and portable. A statue of a god, a royal stele, an inscribed object. These were not simply things, they were charged with identity. To take them was to take prestige, protection, memory, and symbolic authority. When Elamite rulers brought Babylonian monuments to Susa, they were not decorating their city in a casual way, as if someone had found an attractive stone for the garden. They were displaying victory. They were showing that the famous cities of Mesopotamia could be humbled. They were telling their own people and their rivals that Elam had reached into the heart of Babylonian power and returned with proof. One of the great Elamite rulers associated with this kind of power was Shutruk-Nahunta, who ruled in the 12th century before the Common Era. His campaigns into Babylonia were highly significant, and he brought back major monuments to Susa. Under him and his successors, Elam entered one of its strongest phases. The Elamite kings of this period were not merely defending their borders, they were projecting power westward into the heartlands of Mesopotamia. Babylon, which had once seemed like one of the great centres of civilized authority, could be attacked, stripped of sacred objects, and forced to reckon with Elamite strength. The capture of divine statues, especially the statue of Marduk from Babylon in some periods, was an especially serious matter. Marduk was not just any god in Babylon, he was the city's chief deity, central to its identity and kingship. To remove his statue was to wound the city at a religious and political level. A Babylon without Marduk's presence was not merely occupied or defeated, it was spiritually unsettled. Later Babylonian rulers who restored Marduk's statue could present themselves as healers of the city and renewers of order. The removal and return of divine statues became part of the long emotional history between Mesopotamia and Elam. For Babylonians, Elam often became a symbol of Eastern danger. For Elamites, Babylon could be a wealthy rival, whose defeat brought both practical reward and sacred prestige. Neither side was innocent in the gentle modern sense. Both lived in a world where kings measured greatness through conquest, tribute, temple building, and the ability to make enemies write sad poems afterward. The rivalry was harsh because the stakes were high. Control of cities, trade routes, divine symbols, and political legitimacy all mattered. A king who failed against Elam could lose more than territory. He could lose the confidence of his people and the favour of his gods. At the same time, we should not imagine the border between Elam and Mesopotamia as always burning. Trade continued, cultural exchange continued. Elamite elites knew Mesopotamian traditions. Mesopotamians knew of Elamite power, goods and gods. Diplomatic marriages, treaties, envoys and gifts must have moved between courts. People living near the frontier may have had mixed identities or practical relationships that mattered more than royal hostility. A merchant probably cared less about grand civilizational rivalry than about whether the route was safe and the goods arrived. A local farmer near the border may have dreaded armies from either direction with equal sincerity. This is one of the quiet truths of ancient rivalry. Kings make inscriptions, but ordinary people live with the consequences. When Elam and Mesopotamia fought, fields could be damaged, canals neglected, cities plundered, families displaced, and temples stripped. When they traded, people could prosper. When rulers made alliances, soldiers might be spared or redirected elsewhere. The great movements of history rested on the backs of people whose names are mostly gone. A royal victory might be carved into stone, but the person who carried water for the army, repaired a broken cart, baked bread for labourers, or buried a relative after a raid rarely left a personal record. Yet their lives were the substance of the rivalry. The long contest with Sumer, Akkad and Babylon also shaped how Elam understood itself. Rivals helped define identity. A civilization that stands beside a powerful neighbour must decide what to adopt, what to resist, what to transform, and what to defend as its own. Elam adopted elements of Mesopotamian writing, administration, and royal display, but it preserved its own language, gods, and political traditions. It could speak the international language of power while remaining distinct. That is not a contradiction. It is one of the reasons Elam lasted. Culture survived not by remaining untouched, but by choosing how to change without disappearing. Mesopotamia too was shaped by Elam. The presence of a strong eastern neighbour forced Mesopotamian rulers to plan, fortify, negotiate, campaign, and explain failure. Elamite attacks became part of Mesopotamian memory. Elamite involvement in the fall of left a literary wound. Elamite seizure of Babylonian sacred objects created religious and political crises that later kings had to resolve. Even when Mesopotamian sources describe Elam as an enemy, they are admitting its importance. People do not write anxious records about neighbours who do not matter. In the largest view, the rivalry between Elam and Mesopotamia shows us that early civilization was not a single flame spreading outward from one place. It was a field of fires, some brighter in the surviving record than others, but all affecting the winds around them. Sumer developed cities and writing in the river plains. Akkad built an empire and tried to command the surrounding world. Babylon rose from a city to a symbol of kingship, law, and religious prestige. Elam stood beside all of them, sometimes bruised by their expansion, sometimes turning their ambitions back upon them, sometimes carrying their monuments home to Susa as trophies of a world turned upside down. And through all of this, Elam remained difficult to classify from the Mesopotamian viewpoint. It was near but foreign, familiar but strange, civilized, wealthy and organized, yet outside the comfortable centre of Mesopotamian self-imagination. That made it powerful in a particular way. It could not be dismissed as distant wilderness, but it also could not be absorbed fully into the Mesopotamian story. It was the rival next door, the eastern power that kept returning, the reminder that the famous cities of the rivers were not alone. As the centuries passed, this rivalry would continue to change. Assyria would later enter the story with a level of military ferocity that would test Elam more severely than almost anything before. Babylon would rise, fall, recover, and rise again. Elam would have moments of triumph and moments of devastating defeat. But before we follow the wars further, there is another part of Elam that deserves quiet attention. Behind the kings and campaigns, behind the stolen statues and broken cities, there was a language that carried Elamite identity across ages. There were signs pressed into clay, inscriptions carved into stone, scripts that still challenge scholars, and words that remind us that Elam did not only fight beside Mesopotamia, it spoke beside it, wrote beside it, and left a voice that history has not fully silenced. After the armies, the captured monuments, the rival kings, and the long, uneasy border between Elam and Mesopotamia, it is tempting to think of Elam mainly through conflict. That is often how ancient civilizations first appear to us, especially when their neighbours did a great deal of the writing. A king wins a battle, a city falls, a statue is carried away, a border shifts, and suddenly the past looks like a very long argument conducted with spears, bricks, and extremely confident inscriptions. But Elam was not only a power that fought, it was also a civilization that recorded, counted, named, prayed, dedicated, administered, and remembered. It had a voice. Not always an easy voice for us to hear, not always preserved clearly, and not always written in a script that gives up its secrets politely, but a voice all the same. Writing is one of the main reasons Mesopotamia became so vivid in modern history. Its clay tablets survived in great numbers, and once cuneiform was deciphered, the ancient world began speaking in astonishing detail. We can read laws, myths, contracts, letters, school exercises, royal inscriptions, medical texts, omens, recipes, hymns, complaints, and administrative records so precise that one sometimes wonders whether ancient scribes ever got to take a proper nap. Mesopotamia left us a paper trail made of clay, and that trail changed everything. It made its kings louder, its cities clearer, and its stories easier to pass into modern imagination. Elam also wrote, but its written legacy is more difficult. That difficulty has shaped the way people remember it. When a civilization leaves behind texts that are hard to read, fewer people can tell its story in its own words. Its neighbours become louder, its enemies become more influential. Its monuments are seen before its thoughts are heard. This is one of the quiet injustices of ancient history. A culture may have been powerful, complex, and long-lived, but if its writing is scarce, damaged, or only partly understood, it can be pushed into the background, not because it had less to say, but because the sound has not carried as clearly across time. The story of Elamite writing begins very early, in the world around Susa and other sites of southwestern Iran, where people were developing administrative systems at roughly the same broad moment that writing was emerging in Mesopotamia. One of the earliest systems connected with this region is called Proto-Elamite. The name itself is a modern label, and like many modern labels, it tries to be helpful while quietly admitting that the situation is complicated. Proto-Elamite tablets date to the late 4th and early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and they show that people in the region were keeping records, likely connected to goods, labour, animals, fields, or institutional management. These were not bedtime stories pressed into clay, they were practical documents. The ancient world, it turns out, discovered bureaucracy very early, and then never quite recovered from it. Proto-Elamite remains only partly understood. Scholars can recognise patterns, numbers, signs, and administrative structures, but the system has not been fully deciphered in the way Akkadian cuneiform has been. This gives those tablets a special atmosphere. They are not blank, they are not meaningless, they are organised, deliberate, and clearly part of a working system. But they resist full translation. Looking at them is like seeing a ledger from a lost office. where every clerk has gone home thousands of years ago and taken the instruction manual with them. You can tell that someone was counting something. You can tell that order mattered. But the exact voice of the record remains just beyond reach. That is deeply important for Elam's place in early history. Proto-Elamite shows that the people of this region were not merely waiting for Mesopotamia to hand them civilization like a borrowed lamp. They were participating in the earliest experiments with administration, record-keeping, and sign systems. Writing did not appear in one place, and then simply flow outward in a straight line. The early Near East was full of experiments in how to manage growing communities. People needed ways to track grain, livestock, workers, storage, trade, and offerings. Clay became memory. Signs became authority. A mark pressed into a tablet could settle a question better than a person's promise, especially if that person had a creative relationship with honesty. In this early stage, writing was mostly not about literature in the modern sense. It was about control. Who had received goods? Who owed labour? How many animals belonged to a temple or institution? Which jars had been sealed? Which supplies had moved from one place to another? That might sound dry, but it marks an enormous change in human life. A community that can store information outside the human mind can grow more complex. It can manage larger institutions, coordinate labour, remember obligations, and create systems that outlast individual memory. Of course, it can also create paperwork, which may be one of civilization's earliest warning signs. The signs of Proto-Elamite were written on clay tablets, and clay is one of the great accidental gifts of ancient history. People in the ancient Near East used clay because it was available, practical, and easy to impress with signs. They did not choose it because they were thinking kindly of archaeologists several thousand years later. But clay can survive fire, burial, and time in ways that papyrus or leather often cannot. Sometimes destruction baked tablets harder, preserving the very records an invading army may have hoped to erase. History has a strange sense of humour. A burning archive can become a time capsule. After Proto-Elamite, the story becomes even more intriguing with another writing system often called Linear Elamite. This script appears in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era and has long been one of the great puzzles of ancient writing. It is associated with Elamite language and royal inscriptions, and although important progress has been made in understanding it, the details have remained difficult and debated. Unlike the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform, Linear Elamite has a different visual character, with signs made in linear forms. It represents another reminder that Elam's written tradition had its own path. The people of Elam were not only using borrowed systems, they were part of a world where scripts could develop locally, adapt to language, and carry royal identity in distinctive ways. The very existence of these scripts tells us something about Elamite society. Writing is never just writing. It requires training, institutions, materials, habits, and people who believe written records matter. Somewhere in Elam, scribes learned signs. Somewhere, officials expected records. Somewhere, rulers wanted their names preserved. Somewhere, temples and palaces needed accounts. These systems did not float above daily life. They were embedded in it. The person who wrote a tablet might be recording grain for workers, animals for a temple, a royal dedication, or a transaction that mattered deeply to people now completely unknown to us. Each tablet is a small surviving piece of a much larger world of administration and memory. Eventually, Elamite was also written in cuneiform, the great script system of Mesopotamia, adapted for many languages across the ancient Near East. Cuneiform began in southern Mesopotamia, but over time it became one of the major writing technologies of the region. It could be used to write Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian, Eurasian, Old Persian, and Elamite, among others. This is one of the remarkable things about writing systems. A script born in one language can be stretched, adjusted, and repurposed for another. It may not always fit perfectly, rather like borrowing someone else's shoes for a long walk, but it can be made to work. Elamite cuneiform gives us a more readable form of the Elamite language, though it is still limited compared with the vast Akkadian record. Elamite itself is especially interesting because it does not belong clearly to the major known language families around it. It is not Semitic like Akkadian. It is not Sumerian. It is not Indo-European like Old Persian. It stands apart. Scholars often describe it as a language isolate, or at least as a language with no widely accepted relatives. That makes it valuable because it preserves the voice of a people whose linguistic identity was distinct in a region of constant contact. A language isolate can feel lonely on the page, but in real life Elamite was not lonely at all. It lived in a multilingual world. In Susa, scribes might encounter Elamite, Akkadian, and later Old Persian. Diplomatic and administrative life required flexibility. The ancient Near East was full of people who crossed linguistic boundaries for trade, government, marriage, war, and ritual. A language could be local and still international in use. Elamite may not have many known relatives, but it had neighbours, and those neighbours shaped the way it was written and preserved. Language is one of the strongest markers of Elam's independence. Even when Elam borrowed Mesopotamian forms or used cuneiform, it did not simply become Mesopotamian. Its language continued to carry a separate identity. That is important because political power can fall, cities can be conquered, and monuments can be stolen, but language often preserves older patterns of belonging. To speak Elamite was to participate in a tradition that reached back through the deep history of southwestern Iran. It was a thread connecting kings, scribes, officials, and communities across centuries. The Elamite language appears in royal inscriptions, administrative records, and later imperial documents. It carried the names of kings and gods. It recorded dedications and transactions. It helped organize palace economies and regional systems. And perhaps most remarkably, it did not vanish when Elam's independent political power declined. Under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Elamite continued to be used as an administrative language, especially in the great archives associated with Persepolis. That is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for Elam's long afterlife. The Persian Empire did not simply replace the older Elamite world with something entirely new. It built upon it, using Elamite scribal traditions as part of its own imperial administration. This survival changes how we think about conquest and continuity. We often imagine empires sweeping in and erasing what came before. Sometimes they did destroy, sometimes they did impose, but often empires governed by using local expertise. They needed people who knew the land, the goods, the labour systems, the languages, and the habits of administration. Elamite scribes and Elamite language were useful to the Persian state because they belonged to a long-established administrative world. The old civilization had not disappeared into dust. Parts of it were still working in the offices of empire, which is perhaps less dramatic than a battlefield, but in the long run, bureaucracy can be surprisingly durable. The Persepolis fortification tablets, for example, include many records written in Elamite. These documents belong to the administrative system of the Persian Empire, recording movements of goods, rations, workers, officials, animals, and travel. They are not epic poems, but they are deeply revealing. They show Elamite language functioning in the day-to-day machinery of one of the largest empires of the ancient world. A language that began in the old Elamite lands was still being used to run imperial business centuries later. That is not silence. That is survival in a very practical form. There is something almost touching about administrative texts. They are rarely written to impress future generations. They usually concern ordinary necessities: barley, wine, sheep, workers, journeys, supplies. Yet because they are ordinary, they bring us close to real life. A royal inscription may tell us what a king wanted the world to believe. An administrative tablet tells us that someone needed a ration, a delivery, a seal, a receipt. It brings us down from the palace balcony into the storeroom, and in those storerooms, Elamite continued to speak. Still, the Elamite written record leaves many gaps. We do not have a rich library of Elamite myths or literary works comparable to Mesopotamia's surviving epics and hymns. We cannot easily reconstruct everyday speech. We do not know Elamite culture from within as fully as we might wish. This absence has consequences. Without large bodies of readable literature, Elam's inner world can seem distant. We know its kings better than its storytellers, its dedications better than its jokes, its administrative habits better than its lullabies. And the loss of those smaller voices is one of the great sadnesses of ancient history. Yet even through these gaps, the written evidence tells us that Elam was never voiceless. Its inscriptions name rulers who built, restored, fought, and dedicated. Its tablets reveal administration, its scripts show experimentation and adaptation. Its language survived long enough to become part of imperial systems. The silence is partial, not complete. We may not hear everything, but we hear enough to know that a real and distinct civilization stood behind the signs. The act of writing also changed how Elamite kings presented themselves. A king who inscribed his name on a temple, a brick, or a statue was making a claim across time. He was saying that his devotion mattered, that his rule deserved memory, that the gods had received his work and that future people should recognize him. In a world where buildings could crumble and dynasties could fall, writing offered a kind of second life. It could carry the king's name beyond his body. Of course, this worked only if the inscription survived, and if someone could read it, two conditions that history does not always provide. Ancient kings were ambitious, but time is a rather strict editor. For scribes, writing was both skill and status. Learning signs took training. It required memory, discipline, and practice. A scribe stood between speech and administration, between royal command and durable record. In a multilingual environment like Elam, scribes may have had to navigate more than one language or script tradition. Their work helped kingdoms function. They recorded offerings, deliveries, titles, dedications, and perhaps diplomatic correspondence. Without scribes, kings would still shout orders, but those orders would travel less securely through time. The scribe made power portable. It is easy to imagine writing as something abstract, but the physical act mattered. Clay had to be prepared. A stylus had to be held. Signs had to be pressed while the surface was still soft. Tablets had to dry, be stored, sealed, or sent. A mistake could be smoothed over if caught early, but once dried or fired, the record became more stubborn. Writing was a craft of the hand as much as the mind. Every surviving tablet carries not just signs, but gestures. The pressure of a stylus, the rhythm of a trained wrist, the habits of someone who lived in a world unimaginably distant from ours, and yet performed a task we still recognize, making information last. And information is never neutral. What a society writes down tells us what it needed to control, remember, or display. Early accounting tablets tell us that goods and labour mattered. Royal inscriptions tell us that kings wanted legitimacy and memory. Temple dedications tell us that devotion and sacred authority mattered. Administrative archives tell us that empires depended on movement, supplies, and careful records. The written remains of Elam are therefore not just evidence of literacy. They are evidence of structure. They show a society organising itself across city, temple, palace, and empire. Elamite writing also sits at the centre of a larger question. Why are some civilizations remembered clearly while others are blurred? The answer often lies not in how important they were, but in how much of their writing survives and how easily it can be read. If Elam had left behind a vast library of myths, letters, legal cases, school texts, and philosophical reflections, modern imagination might treat it very differently. We might speak of Elamite stories beside Mesopotamian epics. We might quote Elamite wisdom in books. We might know the names of its poets, if poets were writing in forms that survived. Instead, we often meet Elam through kings, enemies, and records. The voice is real, but incomplete. Even so, the incomplete voice has power. It reminds us that history is not only what can be neatly translated. There are civilizations whose memory reaches us through difficulty. They require patience. They ask us to sit with uncertainty rather than filling every gap too quickly. Elam is one of these. Its scripts and language do not offer the easy abundance that Mesopotamia does, but they offer something equally important: proof of a distinct world that kept speaking across ages, even when later history lowered the volume. When we look at Elamite writing, we see a civilization refusing to vanish completely. Proto-Elamite tablets show early administrative intelligence. Linear Elamite points to local script traditions and royal expression. Elamite cuneiform carries the language into more readable historical periods. Achaemenid administrative tablets preserve Elamite within the machinery of empire. Across all these forms, we see continuity through change. The scripts shift. Political structures rise and fall. The language survives in new settings. The voice changes rooms, but it does not immediately die. There is something fitting about that for Elam as a whole. Elam was often beside something louder, beside Mesopotamia, beside Babylon, beside Assyria. Later beside Persia, or rather beneath and within it. But being beside does not mean being absent. The written legacy of Elam proves that. It stands in clay and stone as a quiet correction to the idea that only the most famous civilizations mattered. Elamite words may not always be easy to hear, but they are still there, pressed into tablets, carved into inscriptions, stored in archives, waiting for careful eyes. And as we move onward, that voice leads us toward the more turbulent final centuries of Elamite power. Writing preserved royal pride, sacred dedication, and administrative order. But it also recorded a world under pressure. Elam's kings could build and boast, its scribes could write and count, its gods could receive offerings, but beyond the border larger storms were gathering. Babylon remained a rival, and Assyria would rise with a force that changed the balance of the ancient Near East. The civilization whose language history could not fully silence would soon face wars, gold, gods, and destruction on a scale that tested whether even a deeply rooted power like Elam could endure the weight of empire pressing down from the west. The later story of Elam is where the quiet shadows become louder. Until now we have moved through cities, scripts, gods, temples, and the long relationship between Elam and Mesopotamia. We have seen Elam as a neighbour, a rival, a sacred landscape, and a civilization with its own voice. But ancient history rarely allows any powerful kingdom to remain peacefully admired for long. Power attracts pressure, wealth attracts ambition, sacred objects become targets, borderlands become battlegrounds. And in the centuries when Assyria rose to dominate much of the ancient Near East, Elam found itself facing one of the most aggressive military machines the region had ever seen. To understand the fall of Elamite power, we have to begin with what made Elam worth fighting over in the first place. It was not simply a distant land with a difficult name. Elam had cities, temples, and routes that mattered. It had access to highland resources, political connections, and old prestige. Susa, in particular, was a city with deep memory and visible wealth. Its temples and palaces held objects gathered over generations, including items taken from Mesopotamia during earlier Elamite victories. In the ancient world, treasure was never just treasure. Gold, silver, bronze, carved stone, fine vessels, royal statues, divine images, and inscribed monuments all carried meaning. They were wealth, yes, but also history made solid. To take them was to take more than metal. It was to take memory and make it kneel. Elamite kings understood this very well, because they had done it themselves. During periods of strength, Elamite rulers had invaded Babylonia, carried off monuments, seized sacred objects, and brought them back to Susa. The Stele of Hammurabi, one of the most famous monuments of Babylonian history, was found at Susa because it had been taken there as war booty. The statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, was also removed from Babylon at different moments in the long history of conflict, creating a crisis not only of politics but of religion. If a city lost its god, it had lost part of itself. In our own world, losing a statue from a town square may cause debate and irritation. In the ancient Near East, losing the physical image of a city's god could feel like the universe had formally filed a complaint. This is why war in the ancient Near East was so often described in sacred language. Armies did not only conquer fields and walls, they disturbed the relationship between gods and people. A victorious king could claim that his own gods had supported him, while the defeated city might wonder why its god had allowed disaster. Temples were protected because they were sacred, but they were also attacked because they were powerful. They held wealth, legitimacy, and the visible presence of divine authority. Elam's temples and royal spaces were therefore both symbols of strength and tempting targets for enemies. By the first millennium before the Common Era, the balance of power in the region was changing. Assyria, based in northern Mesopotamia, had become a formidable empire. Assyrian kings built a state capable of sustained military campaigns, harsh punishment, mass deportations, siege warfare, and careful administration. They were not the first conquerors in the ancient Near East, but they became among the most feared. Their royal inscriptions often describe conquest in language so severe that even allowing for royal exaggeration, one gets the impression that Assyrian kings did not attend many relaxation seminars. They wanted obedience, tribute, and recognition of Assyrian supremacy. Those who resisted could expect devastation. Elam, meanwhile, remained deeply entangled with Babylonian politics. Babylon was often under Assyrian pressure, and Babylonian rebels sometimes looked to Elam for support. This made Elam a persistent problem for Assyria. It was not only an independent power to the east, it was a possible shelter, ally, or sponsor for Babylonian resistance. When Babylon rebelled, Elam might intervene. When Assyria tried to stabilize the south, Elam could unsettle it. The old rivalry between Elam and Mesopotamia had now become part of a larger imperial struggle, with Assyria trying to dominate both Babylon and the eastern borderlands. The Assyrian kings could not ignore Elam. At times they campaigned against it. At other times they dealt with Elamite rulers through diplomacy, threats, and shifting alliances. Elam itself was not always united. Internal rivalries, dynastic struggles, and competing claimants weakened it at crucial moments. This is a pattern seen again and again in history. A kingdom facing an external enemy also has to survive its own internal tensions. If the palace is divided while an empire is marching toward the gates, the timing could be better. One of the major figures in this final period was Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria in the 7th century before the Common Era. He is remembered as a powerful ruler, a warrior, and also the king whose library at Nineveh preserved many of the Mesopotamian texts modern scholars later recovered. This creates one of those strange historical contrasts. Ashurbanipal was a patron of learning and a ruthless conqueror. He collected texts with care and destroyed enemies with enthusiasm. Human beings, especially kings, are rarely convenient enough to be only one thing. Ashurbanipal's conflict with Elam was long and bitter. Elam became involved in Babylonian rebellion against Assyria, especially through the revolt led by Shamash-shumukin, Ashurbanipal's brother, who ruled Babylon and eventually rebelled against him. Elamite support for Babylonian resistance made Assyria's anger sharper. From the Assyrian point of view, Elam was not simply defending itself, it was interfering in imperial order and helping rebellion survive. From the Elamite point of view, supporting Babylon may have been a way to contain Assyria, protect regional influence, and prevent one terrifying empire from controlling everything from the mountains to the sea. Ancient diplomacy often involved choosing the danger that seemed slightly less immediate. The wars between Assyria and Elam were brutal. Assyrian armies pushed into Elamite territory, defeated Elamite forces, and took advantage of political instability. Elamite kings rose and fell. Some were killed, some were captured, some were replaced. Assyrian inscriptions describe these events with the usual royal confidence, presenting Assyria as the chosen instrument of divine punishment. But behind the official language were real cities, real families, real temples, and real destruction. When armies moved through Elam, they did not move through an empty map. They moved through fields, settlements, roads, and sacred places where people had lived for generations. The most devastating moment came with the Assyrian destruction of Susa around the middle of the 7th century before the Common Era. Ashurbanipal's forces attacked the city and plundered it on a terrible scale. Assyrian records describe the removal of treasures, the destruction of temples, the desecration of royal tombs, and the carrying away of gods and sacred objects. The language is deliberately humiliating. Assyria wanted not only to defeat Elam, but to break its prestige. Susa was not just another city. It was one of the ancient hearts of Elamite identity. To ravage Susa was to strike at the memory of the civilization itself. The Assyrian account of Susa's destruction is one of the most dramatic and grim records from the ancient Near East. It speaks of temples being entered, treasures being seized, royal graves being disturbed, and the land being made desolate. We should remember that royal inscriptions were propaganda, meant to magnify the king's glory and the enemy's humiliation. Assyrian kings often described destruction in absolute terms even when life later returned. But propaganda works by choosing real events and turning them into a message. Something terrible happened at Susa. The city's wealth was taken, its sacred spaces were violated, its old status was wounded in front of the ancient world. Gold and silver mattered in this destruction, but not only because they were valuable. Assyrian armies took metals, precious objects, and stored wealth from temples and palaces. In doing so, they stripped Elamite institutions of the material signs of power. A temple without its treasures was still sacred in memory perhaps, but politically and ritually damaged. A palace emptied of royal objects was a palace whose authority had been publicly overturned. Wealth in the ancient world was not hidden away as private luxury only. It was displayed, dedicated, redistributed, and used to bind people to gods and kings. When Assyria took that wealth, it was taking part of the system that made Elamite power visible. The gods were even more important. Divine images could be carried away, and this removal had deep symbolic force. Earlier Elam had taken gods and monuments from Mesopotamia. Now Assyria turned that same logic against Elam. The sacred world of the defeated kingdom was dragged into the victor's story. This was revenge at the level of theology. Assyria's message was clear. The gods of Elam had failed, or had been overpowered, or had been handed into Assyrian control. For the people of Elam, whatever they personally believed about the causes of defeat, the result must have been devastating. Temples could be rebuilt, objects could sometimes be replaced. But the shock of sacred humiliation lingered. There is a hard human reality under all this. When we speak of the fall of a hidden empire, we are not speaking only about kings losing crowns. We are speaking about workers losing homes, families losing safety, priests losing temples, craftsmen losing workshops, farmers losing stored grain, and communities losing the confidence that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Ancient inscriptions like to focus on rulers because rulers paid for inscriptions, but destruction is always wider than the palace. It spreads into ordinary life. The city's fall means the baker, the porter, the potter, the child, the old woman at the doorway, the scribe with sore hands, the temple servant, the soldier who did not choose the campaign, all pulled into events too large for them. And yet, even after Susa's devastation, Elam did not vanish in the simple way ancient kings like to claim. This is one of the most important points. Assyrian royal language tried to present the destruction as total. It wanted listeners to believe that Elam had been uprooted completely, that its lands were empty, that its old identity had been erased. But history is rarely that obedient. Assyria itself would fall not long afterward, collapsing in the late 7th century before the Common Era under the pressure of Babylonians, Medes and others. The empire that boasted of destroying Elam did not enjoy eternal victory. Empires have a habit of speaking as if they are permanent right up until they are not. In the aftermath, Elamite lands remained inhabited and important. Political structures changed. Old dynasties weakened. The independent power of Elam as it had existed in earlier centuries was deeply damaged. But the people, language, traditions, and administrative practices did not simply dissolve into the air. The region continued to matter, especially as new Iranian powers rose. The Persians, connected with Anshan and the wider old Elamite landscape, would eventually build the Achaemenid Empire. Susa would become one of its great capitals. Elamite language would remain in administrative use. So the fall of Elamite political independence was not the end of Elamite influence, it was a transformation. This is where the phrase hidden empire becomes useful, but also needs care. Elam was not always an empire in the same form as Assyria, or later Persia. It was a long-lived civilization and regional power with moments of expansion and dominance. It could act like an empire, especially when it projected force into Babylonia, took monuments, and controlled territories. But its structure was different, and its memory was later hidden partly because it became folded into the histories of others. Assyria wrote about defeating it. Persia built upon its land and traditions. Modern history often looked past it toward Mesopotamia or the Achaemenids. Elam became hidden not because it was small, but because later stories stood in front of it. The fall of Elam also teaches us how fragile prestige can be. For centuries, Elam had been strong enough to challenge Mesopotamian states. Its kings had carried off monuments from Babylon. Its temples held wealth. Its city of Susa stood as a sacred and political centre. Then came Assyria, and in one terrible sequence of campaigns, much of that visible power was shattered. A civilization can spend centuries building sacred authority, and an army can damage its symbols in a season. But that does not mean the civilization itself was only symbols. The deeper layers often survive longer than palaces. Think again of Susa after the destruction. The city wounded, its temples plundered, its treasures taken, its graves disturbed. Dust settles over broken spaces. People who remain or return move through a changed landscape. Some buildings are gone or damaged. Some sacred objects are missing. Some families have fled. Some records are lost. Yet the site itself remains valuable. The roots still meet there. The land still holds its old position between plain and plateau. Memory does not disappear simply because a conqueror has declared it dead. People remember where temples stood. They remember names. They rebuild what they can. They adapt. Slowly, life comes back into places that royal inscriptions had pronounced empty. This recovery may not restore the old Elamite kingdom, but it preserves continuity. And continuity can be quieter than conquest. It does not always announce itself with a victory monument. Sometimes it appears as a language still used in administration, a city reused by new rulers, a local tradition absorbed into a larger empire, a family remaining in a region after kings have gone, a craft style continuing under a different political name. This is one reason the end of Elam is not a clean ending. It is a change in form. The old independent power was broken, but the Elamite world remained part of the foundation beneath what came next. There is also a kind of historical justice in the fact that Assyria, despite its violence, preserved some of the memory of Elam through its own records. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions wanted to celebrate Elam's humiliation. Instead, they also tell us how important Elam was. You do not boast so fiercely about destroying something insignificant. The intensity of Assyrian language reveals the seriousness of the rivalry. Elam mattered enough to be hated, feared, punished, and recorded. In that sense, even hostile texts become witnesses. They speak against Elam, but they also prove Elam's place in the world. The gold taken from Susa, the gods carried away, the tombs violated, the royal names mocked. All of these details show us how the fall was staged as a public undoing of power. Assyria wanted to reverse Elam's earlier triumphs, to answer the old humiliations suffered by Mesopotamian cities, and to end the eastern threat once and for all. It succeeded in breaking Elam as a major independent rival, but it did not erase the deeper history. No army can fully destroy the centuries that came before it. It can burn archives, smash walls, and take statues. It cannot make Susa never have existed. It cannot make Chogha Zanbil never have risen. It cannot make Elamite scribes never have pressed signs into clay. It cannot make the old rivalry with Sumer, Akkad and Babylon disappear. As night settles over this part of the story, Elam feels both wounded and strangely enduring. Its kings lose their old strength, its temples suffer, its treasures are taken, its name grows quieter in later memory, and still, beneath the damage, something remains. The land remains. The city remains. The language continues in new settings. The old Elamite regions become part of the rise of Persia. The ruins hold their shape under the sun. Archaeologists, much later, begin to recover what kings tried to bury under boasts of victory. A hidden empire falls, but its traces continue to work their way upward through the soil. And that brings us toward the final turn of the journey. After war, after plunder, after the gods of one city were carried into the halls of another, the question becomes not only why Elam fell, but why it still matters. What does a forgotten civilization leave behind when its kings are gone and its language is only partly heard? What survives in ruins, in later empires, in broken tablets, in old sacred places, and in the memory of a world that once rivaled Mesopotamia? To answer that, we have to listen carefully to what Elam still whispers from the ruins. Not loudly, not completely, but enough to remind us that history is always larger than the names we remember first. What Elam still whispers from the ruins is not one simple message. It is not the kind of past that stands up, clears its throat and explains itself neatly from beginning to end. Elam does not come back to us as a complete book, with every page numbered and every name easy to pronounce. It comes back as a city mound, a broken brick, a royal name on an inscription, a temple foundation, a language that survived in offices after kings had fallen, a monument carried away from Babylon and found in Susa, a ziggurat still rising from the plain long after the ceremonies around it went quiet. It comes back in fragments, and those fragments ask for patience. That may be the first lesson Elam gives us. Not all important civilizations are remembered loudly. Some leave huge pyramids, long texts, famous myths, and monuments that become symbols for the whole world. Others remain half-hidden because their writing is harder to read. Their cities were rebuilt by later powers. Their monuments were damaged, or their story was told mostly by rivals. Elam belongs to this quieter group. It was old, powerful, and deeply connected to the great events of the ancient Near East, yet it is still far less familiar than the names that surrounded it. Mesopotamia became a headline. Elam became a margin note, but sometimes the margin note changes the meaning of the whole page. When we look back over Elam's long story, the first thing that stands out is endurance. This civilization did not appear for a moment and vanish. It lasted, changed, recovered, and reappeared across thousands of years. It watched Sumerian city-states rise in the river plains. It dealt with Akkadian imperial ambition. It pushed back against the kings of Ur. It fought and traded with Babylon. It built sacred monuments of its own. It spoke a language that did not simply dissolve into the languages around it. It survived terrible violence from Assyria, and even after its independent power was broken, parts of its tradition continued into the Persian imperial world. That is not a small historical footprint. It is a long shadow, even if the shadow is sometimes difficult to see. Susa is one of the clearest places where that shadow remains. The city's ruins remind us that history is often layered rather than replaced. Susa was early, Elamite, Mesopotamian facing, Persian, and later still many other things across time. It was not a city that belonged to one moment only. It became a place where different civilizations left traces on the same ground. In the soil of Susa, the past does not sit in separate boxes. It overlaps, One building rises over another. One ruler reuses the prestige of an older place. One language gives way to another without every older habit disappearing. This is how real history works more often than not. It is less like changing a stage set and more like living in a house that has been repaired for centuries, where every wall contains evidence of previous owners, previous problems, and previous ideas about where the door should have been. Elam also reminds us that geography matters. The land between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau was not empty space between more important worlds. It was a zone of movement and power. Elam's position gave it access to trade routes, highland resources, lowland agriculture, and political influence. It could look west to the great river cities and east toward the mountains. This gave the civilization a special role. It was a bridge, but not a passive bridge that others simply crossed. It controlled, shaped, resisted, and benefited from the movement between regions. In the ancient world, a place like that could become wealthy and dangerous. It could become the neighbour everyone needed and no one fully trusted. That role is easy to underestimate if we only focus on the most famous centres. Mesopotamia often appears as the place where civilization happened, while surrounding regions are treated as background. Elam challenges that view. It shows that early civilization was not one bright centre surrounded by darkness. It was a network of bright and half-bright places, some recorded more clearly than others. Cities, trade routes, highland communities, temples, ports, and borderlands all helped make the ancient world function. The plain needed the mountain. The city needed the route. The palace needed the mine, the timber, the stone, the animals, and the people who could bring them. Elam stood in that wider system, not outside it. The ruins also whisper about rivalry. Elam's relationship with Mesopotamia was long, complicated, and often painful. It was not simply a story of one civilization influencing another. It was a story of competition between powers that knew each other well. Elamite rulers sometimes fought Mesopotamian kings and sometimes borrowed from Mesopotamian practice. Mesopotamian rulers sometimes tried to dominate Elam and sometimes had to negotiate with it. Babylonian monuments ended up in Susa. Elamite gods and kings appear in records from the west. Each side helped define the other. Rivalry can be destructive, but it can also be revealing. You often learn what a civilization values by seeing what its enemies try to take from it. In Elam's case, enemies took gods, treasures, and royal symbols. That tells us those things mattered. Temples were not just religious buildings. They were centres of power and memory. Divine images were not just art. They were the presence of protection and legitimacy. Royal inscriptions were not just decoration. They were efforts to anchor names in time. When Assyria attacked Susa and boasted of carrying away wealth and sacred objects, it was trying to dismantle Elam's visible authority. But the need to boast so strongly tells us something important. Assyria did not treat Elam as a minor annoyance. It treated Elam as a serious opponent whose defeat needed to be displayed. That is one of the strange ways history preserves what it tries to destroy. Assyrian records meant to humiliate Elam now help prove its significance. Babylonian grief over stolen gods and captured monuments shows us how far Elamite power once reached. Mesopotamian anger becomes evidence. A rival's complaint becomes testimony. Even when Elam speaks through the mouths of others, the outline of its importance comes through. It is not the best way to be remembered, of course. No civilization would choose to have its biography written mostly by irritated neighbours. But even that kind of memory can be valuable if we read it carefully. Elam's own voice, though quieter, remains just as important. The Elamite language is one of the most powerful signs of its distinct identity. It was not simply another form of Akkadian or Sumerian. It stood apart, and it lasted. The early scripts connected with Elam, including Proto-Elamite and Linear Elamite, show that the region had its own experiments in record-keeping and written expression. Later, Elamite cuneiform gives us royal and administrative texts. And long after Elam's old kingship had weakened, Elamite remained useful in the Persian imperial administration. a language that continues to work inside a later empire, has not been silenced. It has changed its setting. This survival gives us a different kind of legacy. People often look for legacy in monuments because monuments are easy to see. A ziggurat still standing in the landscape seems more impressive than a clay tablet listing rations. But administration can be a deep form of continuity. When Persian officials used Elamite records to manage goods, workers, travel and supplies, they were relying on older scribal traditions rooted in the Elamite world. The Empire of Persia did not rise from empty ground. It rose in lands that had long histories, old cities, experienced administrators, and local systems of knowledge. Elam was part of that foundation. This is especially important because the rise of Persia often overshadows what came before. The Achaemenid Empire was so large and impressive that it can make earlier cultures of the Iranian plateau seem like a preface. But Elam was not just a preface. It was a major civilization in its own right. Still, it also helped prepare the ground for what followed. Susa became one of the great Persian capitals. Anshan, deeply connected to Elamite history, became associated with the early Persian royal line. Elamite language remained in official use. In this way, Elam did not simply disappear before Persia. It was absorbed, transformed, and carried forward. The ruins whisper this kind of continuity if we listen for it. A fallen kingdom does not always mean a dead culture. Sometimes the political name fades while the people remain. Sometimes the language changes function. Sometimes sacred places lose their original rituals but keep their prestige. Sometimes a later empire builds on old roads, old cities, old administrative habits, and old memories. History is full of these quiet survivals. They are not as dramatic as a battle, but they may last longer. Elam also reminds us to be careful with the word forgotten. Forgotten by whom? The people who lived in Elam did not think of themselves as forgotten. Later communities in the region did not live in a blank space. Ancient memories, local traditions, and practical knowledge often continue even when modern textbooks do not give them much room. What we mean is that Elam became forgotten in the wider popular imagination. It slipped behind Mesopotamia, behind Persia, behind the better-known stories. But archaeology has a way of correcting our habits. A mound, a brick, a tablet, or a temple can say, wait, there is more here. You have been looking too quickly. Looking too quickly is one of the great dangers in ancient history. We see a famous name and rush toward it. We see an unfamiliar name and pass over it. But the ancient world was not arranged according to what modern people would later find easy to remember. It was full of powers that mattered in their own time. Elam mattered. It mattered to Sumerian cities seeking resources and security. It mattered to Akkadian kings who wanted eastern control. It mattered to Ur, whose fall was tied to eastern forces. It mattered to Babylon, whose gods and monuments could be carried away. It mattered to Assyria, which spent so much effort trying to crush it. And it mattered to Persia, which inherited and used parts of its world. The physical ruins of Elam carry the weight of that importance. Chogha Zanbil, even damaged, shows royal ambition and sacred planning. Susa shows deep urban continuity and cultural meeting. Inscriptions show kings trying to preserve their names. Tablets show administration and language. Captured monuments show the movement of power between rivals. None of these pieces alone gives the whole picture. Together they form a civilization that's difficult to ignore once you know where to look. There is also a human whisper in these ruins. Behind the name Elam were not only kings and gods, but ordinary people. Farmers worked fields in the heat. Craftsmen shaped vessels, tools, ornaments and seals. Scribes learned signs and probably made mistakes under the eyes of teachers. Priests prepared offerings. Traders moved goods along routes that connected plains and mountains. Soldiers stood at borders or marched into wars they may not have fully understood. Children grew up under the protection of city gods whose temples seemed permanent. Families survived bad harvests, new rulers, taxes, rumours, and the ordinary worries that have followed human beings everywhere. a civilization is not only its greatest buildings, it is also breakfast, work, illness, repair, argument, prayer, and sleep. That may be why Elam feels especially worth remembering. It was powerful enough to shape the fate of famous kingdoms, but obscure enough that we have to work to see the people inside it. We cannot recover every voice. We cannot hear the market gossip of Susa, the songs sung in courtyards, the private prayers whispered before a journey, or the jokes made by tired workers carrying bricks for a king's sacred project. Some parts of the past are gone beyond recovery, but enough remains to remind us that these people lived in a world as real to them as ours is to us. Their present was not ancient, it was immediate. The sun was hot, the clay was wet, the temple was sacred, the king was powerful, the border was dangerous, the harvest mattered. Elam's ruins also warn us about pride. Mesopotamian kings claimed victory, Elamite kings carried off monuments, Assyrian kings boasted of destruction. Persian kings later built on old ground. Each power in its own time appeared solid. Each believed its order could last. Yet all of them changed, fell, or were absorbed into something else. The ruins do not mock them exactly, but they do place human ambition in perspective. A king may carve his name into brick to make it permanent. Thousands of years later, that brick may survive, but the palace is gone. The language is studied by specialists, and the king depends on strangers to pronounce his name correctly. Time is patient, but not especially impressed. Still, the survival of any trace is remarkable. A broken inscription is a small victory against forgetting. A city mound is a long memory held in earth. A script partly understood is a conversation not fully lost. A temple ruin is evidence that people once organised labour, belief, and royal authority into a structure meant to reach beyond ordinary life. These remains are not complete, but they are enough. They allow Elam to step out of the background and stand beside the civilizations it once rivaled. So what does Elam still whisper? It whispers that the ancient Near East was wider than the stories we usually tell. It whispers that Mesopotamia was never alone. It whispers that trade routes can be as important as capitals, that borderlands can shape empires, that languages can survive political collapse, and that a civilization can be forgotten by popular memory without ever having been unimportant. It whispers that ruins are not empty. They are full of unfinished conversations. And perhaps it also whispers something about how we remember our own world. We live surrounded by records, buildings, systems, cities, and names we assume will be understood later. But the future is not guaranteed to read us clearly. It may find our strongest monuments confusing, our documents incomplete, our proudest claims slightly embarrassing, and our ordinary objects more revealing than we expect. The people of Elam did not know they would become a mystery. They lived forward, as all people do. Their world became ancient only after enough time had passed. As we leave Elam now, we do not have to pretend that every question has been answered. It would not be honest, and Elam would not suit that kind of neat ending anyway. Much remains uncertain. Some scripts are still difficult. Some political relationships are debated. Some sacred meanings are only partly visible. But uncertainty does not make the civilization less real. It simply reminds us that the past is not a finished museum label. It is a landscape we keep learning to read. Somewhere beneath the dust of southwestern Iran, beneath the remains of Susa, beyond the weathered bricks of Chogha Zanbil, along old roads that once connected plains to mountains, Elam still waits in pieces, not silent, not lost completely, just quieter than the empires that shouted around it. And after following its cities, kings, temples, wars, writing and survival, we can hear it more clearly than before. Elam was not a footnote beside Mesopotamia. It was one of the great old powers of the ancient world, a civilization that stood at the edge of famous rivers and rising mountains, watching, trading, fighting, building, praying, writing, falling, and still, after all this time, leaving enough behind for us to listen.